lovely urgent listeners. Welcome back to our podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of cultures, traditions, and everyday life. I'm Mira, and I'm super to be here with my co-host, the one and only Leo.
Thanks, Mira. It's great to be back, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear what we've got in store for them today. By the way, have you guys noticed that our coffee cups have been getting more and more creative? I mean, who needs boring old coffee cups when you can have ones with cute cartoon characters?
Oh, Leo, you're such a kid at heart. But seriously, we've got an amazing episode lined up for you today. As you know, we love sharing our experiences and insights with you, and today is no exception. Between our previous podcast and this one, we've had some hilarious moments that we just can't wait to share with you.
Like the time Mira accidentally spilled coffee all over her shirt and then tried to pass it off as a fashion statement? Or the time I tried to cook breakfast and ended up setting the kitchen on fire? Okay, maybe that one wasn't so funny, but it was definitely memorable.
Oh, Theo, you're such a charmer. But anyway, let's get to the point. Today, we're going to be comparing two countries that are quite different from each other, Denmark and Nauru. Now, I know what's your Denmark. Isn't that just a bunch of happy, smiling people eating pastries and wearing woolen socks? And to that, I say, well, yes, it's actually not far from the truth. But Nauru, on the other hand, is a tiny island nation in the Pacific that's often overlooked by travelers.
That's right, Mira, and that's exactly why we're here to give you the lowdown on both countries. With today's podcast, we'll be answering all your questions about Denmark and Nauru, from the cost of living to the food, culture, and even the weather. So, if you're moving to one of these countries or just want to learn more about them, then this podcast is for you.
Absolutely. Leo! And to make things even more interesting, we're powered by Atoll AI, which means we get to bring you the best of both worlds, our own unique insights, and the latest information from around the globe. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn all about Denmark and Nauru.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Folks, we'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you may have. And if you're feeling generous, you can even support us on Patreon. But enough about that for now. Let's get started with our comparison of Denmark and Nauru.
That's right. Leo. And to begin, let's talk about the cost of living in both countries. Denmark is known for being one of the most expensive countries in the world. But is it really that bad? And what about Nauru? Is it a budget-friendly option for travelers and expats?
Great question, Mira. And to answer that, we'll be diving into the world of housing, food, transportation, and even healthcare. So, stay tuned, folks, and get ready for a comprehensive guide to Denmark and Nauru.
And don't worry, we'll try to keep it as engaging as possible. After all, who doesn't love a good comparison of two countries? It's like a game show. But instead of prizes, we'll be giving away knowledge and insights.
That's a great way to put it. Mira! And speaking of games, have you guys heard about the game of Spot the Danish Person? It's a game where you try to find a Dane who's not wearing woolen socks. Just kidding. Phone. But seriously, Denmark is a wonderful country with a lot to offer. And we can't wait to share our experiences with you.
That's right. Leah. And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we'll be sharing behind-the-scenes content and sneak peeks of our upcoming episodes. We'd love to hear from you and connect with our community.
And don't forget to use the hashtag Denmark versus Nauru. Folks, we'll be sharing our favorite moments and quotes from the podcast, and we'd love to see what you guys are saying too.
That's right, Leo. And with that, let's get started on our comparison of Denmark and Nauru. It's going to be a wild ride. Folks, so buckle up and get ready to learn. So, Let's dive into the fascinating world of general safety and crime rates in Denmark and Nauru, two countries with vastly different crime profiles. Don't you think, Leah?
Indeed. Mira, Denmark is known for its low crime rates, with a strong emphasis on community, policing, and social welfare. On the other hand, Nauru has struggled with high crime rates, including domestic violence and theft.
That's right. Denmark's focus on social welfare and community policing has contributed to its low crime rates. But what about Nauru? How do you think the country's isolation, unlimited resources affect its crime situation?
Great question. Mia, Nauru's isolation, unlimited resources do make it a challenging environment for addressing crime. However, the country has made efforts to improve its police force and community programs.
I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of HJ School in Denmark, where young people can attend alternative education programs to prevent juvenile delinquency?
Actually, Mira, I think that's a fantastic initiative. It's great to see Denmark investing in alternative education programs to prevent crime. In Nauru, I've heard that the government has implemented programs to address domestic violence and provide support for victims.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, it's great to see both countries making efforts to address crime and support their communities. I'm sure our listeners living in Nauru would agree that it's a challenging environment, but also a beautiful one with a rich culture.
Absolutely. Mira, Nauru may have its challenges, but it's also a country with a rich history and culture. And speaking of culture, have you heard about the concept of Hygge in Denmark, where people prioritize coziness and community to prevent crime?
Ah, yes. Hygge is such an interesting concept. Leo, it's great to see Denmark prioritizing community and coziness to prevent crime. I'm curious, have you ever experienced Hygge firsthand in Denmark?
Well, Mira, it's kind of like I said. I may not have experienced it firsthand, but I've certainly heard about it. And I think it's a great example of how Denmark prioritizes community and social welfare to prevent crime.
That's so fascinating. Leo, it's great to see Denmark prioritizing community and social welfare. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Hygge and how it affects crime rates in Denmark.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of listeners, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the concept of Hygge and its impact on crime rates. Do you think it's a viable solution for countries like Nauru?
Well, Leo, I think that's a great question. While Hygge may not be a direct solution for Nauru, it's certainly an interesting example of how community and social welfare can impact crime rates. Perhaps our listeners can share their thoughts on how Nauru could implement similar programs to address crime.
Mira, you're always so optimistic. But seriously, I think it's great that you're encouraging our listeners to share their thoughts. And speaking of thoughts, I have one. What about the role of technology in addressing crime in both Denmark and Nauru?
Great point. Yeah, technology can certainly play a role in addressing crime, from surveillance systems to online reporting platforms. But how do you think Nauru could implement technology to address its unique crime challenges?
Well, Mira, I think Nauru could use technology to improve its police force's response times and community engagement. Perhaps a mobile app or online platform could help residents report crimes and access support services.
That's a great idea. Leo, and I think Denmark's use of technology to address crime is a great example for Nauru to follow. Perhaps our listeners could share their thoughts on how technology could be used to address crime in Nauru.
Mira, you're always so full of ideas. But seriously, I think it's great that we're having this conversation about general safety and crime rates in Denmark and Nauru.
Well, Leo, I think that's all for now. But before we go, I just want to say that I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about general safety and crime rates in both countries. Perhaps we can continue this conversation in a future episode.
Mira, you're always so optimistic. But seriously, I think that's a great idea. Let's continue this conversation in a future episode and explore more ways that Denmark and Nauru can address crime and support their communities.
I'm curious. Leo, how does Denmark manage to maintain such a high level of social harmony? It's almost like a fairy tale, don't you think?
Indeed it does, Mira. But let's dive into the numbers. Denmark's government is known for its stability, with a strong focus on social welfare and equality. I'm sure all listeners living in this country would agree with me that it's a major contributor to the country's peaceful atmosphere.
That's a great point. Leo, and have you heard about Denmark's famous flexicurity system? It's a unique approach to employment that balances flexibility with security, allowing workers to switch between jobs and industries with ease.
Yes. Flexicurity is a game changer. And it's not just about employment. Denmark's emphasis on education and social mobility has created a highly skilled and adaptable workforce. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they think it's a key factor in Denmark's social harmony?
I think it's a big part of it. Leo, and let's not forget about Denmark's strong social safety net, with a comprehensive system of unemployment benefits, healthcare, and education. Citizens feel secure and supported. It's no wonder that Denmark consistently ranks high in happiness and life satisfaction surveys.
That's right. Mira. And it's not just about the government's policies. Denmark's culture is also deeply rooted in social responsibility and community engagement. From volunteer work to neighborhood initiatives, Danes are known for their commitment to helping others. I'm sure our listeners have noticed this when interacting with locals.
Absolutely. Leo, and have you heard about Denmark's unique approach to conflict resolution? Instead of relying on the courts, Danes often use mediation and negotiation to resolve disputes. It's a great example of how social harmony can be achieved through collaborative problem solving.
Oh, yes. Mediation is a powerful tool. And it's not just about conflict resolution. Denmark's emphasis on transparency and accountability has created a culture of trust and cooperation. I'm not sure if our listeners are aware of this, but Denmark's government is actually one of the most transparent in the world.
That's fascinating. Leo, and it's not just about government transparency. Denmark's strong civil society and media landscape also play a crucial role in promoting social harmony. From local newspapers to community radio stations, Danes have a strong voice in shaping public opinion and holding their leaders accountable.
That's right. Mira. And let's not forget about Denmark's commitment to international cooperation and peacekeeping. As a member of the United Nations, Denmark is actively working to promote global stability and security. It's a great example of how a small country can make a big impact on the world stage.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree that Denmark's commitment to international cooperation is a key factor in maintaining global peace and stability. And speaking of stability, let's compare this to Nauru's situation. Has Nauru's government managed to balance social harmony with the challenges of a small island nation?
Well, Mira, Nauru's government faces some unique challenges, including a limited economy and a high reliance on foreign aid. However, the Nauruan people are known for their resilience and adaptability, and the government has made efforts to promote social harmony through community development programs and cultural events.
That's great to hear. Leo, and have you heard about Nauru's unique approach to education? The country has a strong focus on traditional knowledge and cultural preservation, which is reflected in its curriculum and educational programs.
Yes. Education is a vital component of Nauru's social development. And it's not just about education. Nauru's government has also made efforts to promote cultural heritage and community engagement through various initiatives. I'm not sure if our listeners are aware of this, but Nauru has a rich cultural heritage that is worth exploring.
That's right. Leo, and let's not forget about Nauru's commitment to international cooperation and regional development. As a member of the Pacific Islands Forum, Nauru is actively working to promote regional stability and security. It's a great example of how a small country can make a big impact in the Pacific region.
Indeed it is. Mira, and it's not just about international cooperation. Nauru's government has also made efforts to promote social harmony through community development programs and cultural events. I'm sure our listeners would agree that this is an important aspect of maintaining social stability in a small island nation.
For more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jetoff AI, where you can find in-depth analysis and expert opinions on global issues, from political stability to social harmony. Jetoff AI has got you covered.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more engaging discussions on global issues. We'd love to hear from you. What do you think about Denmark's and Nauru's approaches to social harmony?
I'm curious. Leah, how do you think Denmark's economy compares to Nauru's when it comes to cost of living? I mean, one's a Nordic powerhouse, and the other's a tiny Pacific island nation.
Great question. Mira, well, Denmark's economy is incredibly stable, with a strong social safety net, high standard of living, and low unemployment. Nauru, on the other hand, has a more challenging economic landscape, with a small and fragile economy, high unemployment, and a reliance on foreign aid.
That's right. And I think it's interesting that Denmark has a reputation for being one of the happiest countries in the world, despite its high cost of living. Meanwhile, Nauru struggles with poverty and unemployment, making it a much tougher place to live.
Exactly. And I think one of the key factors is Denmark's strong social safety net and high taxes. While it may seem counterintuitive, the Danes are willing to pay high taxes in exchange for a high standard of living, excellent public services, and a strong social safety net.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that the trade-off is worth it. But what about Nauru? How do the locals feel about the economic situation?
Well, I think it's fair to say that many Norwegians are frustrated with the economic situation and feel that the government is not doing enough to address the challenges they face. There's a sense of hopelessness and despair, which is understandable given the difficulties they're facing.
That's heartbreaking to hear. But what about the cost of living in Nauru? I've heard it's extremely high, especially when it comes to imported goods.
Yes, that's true. The cost of living in Nauru is indeed high, and it's mainly due to the country's reliance on imports. Everything from food to clothing to household goods has to be imported, which drives up the cost of living.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's fair that Nauru has such a high cost of living, considering its small size and limited resources?
Great question. Mira, I think it's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. But one thing is certain: the cost of living in Nauru is a major challenge for many people, and it's something that the government needs to address.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting that Denmark has a strong focus on sustainability and renewable energy. How does that compare to Nauru's energy situation?
Well, Nauru is actually one of the most energy-dependent countries in the world, and it relies heavily on fossil fuels. In contrast, Denmark is a leader in renewable energy, with a focus on wind power and other sustainable energy sources.
That's fascinating. And I think it's no coincidence that Denmark's strong focus on sustainability has contributed to its high standard of living and low unemployment.
Exactly. And I think it's a lesson that Nauru could learn from, especially when it comes to developing its own energy resources and reducing its reliance on fossil fuels.
Well, there you have it. Folks, Denmark and Nauru, two countries with very different economic conditions and cost of living situations. But what do you think? Do you have any insights or experiences to share about living in either of these countries?
Yes. I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a strong focus on education and skills training, which has contributed to its high standard of living and low unemployment. In contrast, Nauru struggles with a lack of skilled workers and a high dropout rate.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's interesting that Denmark has a strong social safety net and high taxes, which may seem counterintuitive, but has contributed to its high standard of living.
Exactly. And I think it's a lesson that Nauru could learn from, especially when it comes to developing its own human resources and reducing its reliance on foreign aid.
Well, there you have it, folks. Denmark and Nauru, two countries with very different economic conditions and cost of living situations. But what do you think? Do you have any insights or experiences to share about living in either of these countries?
Yes. I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a strong focus on innovation and entrepreneurship, which has contributed to its high standard of living and low unemployment. In contrast, Nauru struggles with a lack of innovation in entrepreneurship, which has contributed to its economic challenges.
That's a great point. And I think it's interesting that Denmark has a strong social safety net and high taxes, which may seem counterintuitive but has contributed to its high standard of living.
Exactly. And I think it's a lesson that Nauru could learn from, especially when it comes to developing its own human resources and reducing its reliance on foreign aid.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our discussion on economic conditions and cost of living in Denmark and Nauru. But before we go, let's hear from you. Folks, what do you think about the economic situation in either of these countries? So, when it comes to accommodation options in Denmark, you've got a lot of choices, from cozy apartments in Copenhagen to luxurious villas in the countryside.
That's right. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree that the country has a great selection of housing options.
Yes, and I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most popular type of accommodation among expats in Denmark?
Well, from what I've seen, many expats opt for apartments in city centers, especially in Copenhagen, where the rent can be a bit higher but the convenience and amenities are worth it.
That makes sense. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the advice on finding affordable accommodation in Copenhagen.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a great public transportation system. So, even if you don't live in the city center, you can still easily get around without a car.
That's true. And I've heard that the Danish concept of HYGCG, or coziness, is a big part of the country's culture, including its homes and apartments.
Exactly. Mira. And I think that's one of the things that makes Denmark so attractive to expats, the emphasis on community and comfort in daily life.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the concept of HYGCG. Do they have any favorite ways to experience it in their daily lives?
Great question, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to share their thoughts on HYGG and how it relates to their experiences in Denmark.
Moving on to Nauru. I've heard that accommodation options are quite limited, especially for expats.
That's right, Mira. And I've been told that the island has a small selection of apartments and houses, mostly in the capital city of YRN.
I can imagine that would be challenging for expats, especially if they're not used to living in a small island community.
Yes, and I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a unique cultural and historical context, which can be both fascinating and challenging for expats to navigate.
That's so true. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice on how to adapt to the cultural and environmental challenges of living in Nauru.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a strong sense of community, which can be a big plus for expats who are looking for a close-knit community.
I'm curious. Leo, have you heard any stories about expats who have successfully adapted to life in Nauru?
Yes. I've heard stories about expats who have really immersed themselves in the local culture and have had some amazing experiences, like learning to fish and cook traditional Nauruan dishes.
Well, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about those experiences.
And I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a unique environmental context, with its coral reefs and marine life, which can be a big draw for expats who love the outdoors.
That's so true. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice on how to make the most of Nauru's natural beauty.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a strong focus on sustainability and environmental conservation, which can be a big plus for expats who share those values.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the biggest challenge for expats when it comes to accommodation in Nauru?
Well, I think it's the limited selection of accommodation options, as well as the challenges of adapting to the island's unique cultural and environmental context.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice on how to overcome those challenges and find the right accommodation for their needs.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a strong sense of community, which can be a big help for expats who are looking for support and guidance.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the challenges of living in Nauru. Do they have any tips or advice for expats who are considering moving there?
Ah, great question, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love to share their thoughts and experiences on living in Nauru.
Moving on to the topic of accommodation quality. I've heard that Denmark has a reputation for having some of the highest quality housing in the world.
That's right, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a strong focus on design and functionality in its homes and apartments.
I can imagine that would be appealing to expats who are looking for a comfortable and stylish living space.
Yes. And I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a great selection of high-end furniture and home decor stores, which can be a big plus for expats who want to make their homes feel like a true Danish experience.
I'm curious. Leo, have you heard any stories about expats who have successfully incorporated Danish design and style into their homes?
Yes. I've heard stories about expats who have really immersed themselves in the local culture and have had some amazing experiences, like taking a design course or visiting a local design studio.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about those experiences.
And I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a strong focus on sustainability and environmental conservation, which can be a big plus for expats who share those values.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice on how to incorporate those values into their daily lives, especially when it comes to housing and accommodation.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a unique cultural and environmental context, which can be both fascinating and challenging for expats to navigate.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the biggest challenge for expats when it comes to accommodation in Nauru?
Well, I think it's the limited selection of accommodation options, as well as the challenges of adapting to the island's unique cultural and environmental context.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice on how to overcome those challenges and find the right accommodation for their needs.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a strong sense of community, which can be a big help for expats who are looking for support and guidance.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the challenges of living in Nauru. Do they have any tips or advice for expats who are considering moving there?
Great question, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would love.
So, let's dive into the bureaucratic world of Denmark and Nauru. I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that navigating official procedures can be a challenge. But which country makes it easier for expats to settle in? Let's start with Denmark.
Denmark, the land of happy Vikings. Of course, very happy bureaucrats. Just kidding, Mira. But seriously, Denmark has made significant efforts to simplify its immigration procedure. They've introduced the positive list system, which allows highly skilled workers to obtain a work permit more easily.
That's true. Leo, and I think it's worth noting that Denmark also has a relatively straightforward process for obtaining a residence permit. I'm curious, have you heard about the integration contract that Danish authorities require of all new residents?
Yes, I have. And I must say, it's a clever way to ensure that newcomers integrate into Danish society. By signing the contract, residents commit to learning Danish, getting a job, and contributing to the community. It's a win-win for both the individual and the country.
Exactly. Speaking of job opportunities, I've heard that Denmark has a very high standard of living and a strong economy. But what about Nauru? How does it compare in terms of official procedures and job opportunities?
Well, Nauru, the tiny island nation in the Pacific, has a unique set of challenges when it comes to immigration and official procedures. Due to its remote location, Nauru has limited resources and infrastructure, making it difficult for expats to navigate the system. However, the Norwegian government has made efforts to improve its online services and streamline its processes.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the visa requirements for both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the types of visas available in Denmark?
Of course, Mira, Denmark offers a range of visas, including the work permit visa, which allows highly skilled workers to live and work in the country. There's also the family reunification visa, which enables family members of Danish citizens or residents to join their loved ones in Denmark.
That's great information. And for our listeners who might be considering moving to Nauru, what can they expect in terms of visa requirements and official procedures?
Well, Mira, I think it's safe to say that Nauru's visa requirements are a bit more unpredictable. But, in all seriousness, the Nauruan government has introduced a new online visa application system, which makes it easier for expats to apply for a visa. However, it's still essential to research and understand the requirements carefully.
That's a great tip, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique set of challenges when it comes to immigration and official procedures. But with the right information and preparation, expats can navigate the system and settle in successfully.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think our listeners would agree that it's essential to be flexible and adaptable when navigating official procedures in a new country. Whether it's Denmark or Nauru, the key is to stay informed and be prepared for any challenges that come your way.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Leo, thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. And to our listeners, we hope you found this information helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
And as always, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more updates and insights on expat life in Denmark and Nauru.
Let's dive into the healthcare systems in Denmark and Nauru. Both countries have different strengths and challenges, but which one offers better access to and quality of health services? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Leo.
Great point, Mira. As we compare healthcare systems, it's essential to consider the cultural and economic factors that influence access to quality care. In Denmark, the public healthcare system is highly regarded, with a strong emphasis on preventive care and community-based services.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Denmark's healthcare system is one of the best in the world. But what about Nauru? I read that they have a more limited healthcare system, with limited access to specialized care.
Exactly. Nauru's healthcare system is indeed more limited, and they rely heavily on external aid and partnerships with other countries to provide basic healthcare services. However, it's worth noting that Nauru has made significant strides in improving their healthcare system in recent years, particularly in the area of maternal and child health.
Well, I didn't know that. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But, in all seriousness, Leo, it's clear that Denmark's healthcare system has more resources and a stronger infrastructure.
Absolutely, Mira. But, as we said earlier, cultural and economic factors also play a significant role in shaping healthcare systems. In Nauru, for example, traditional medicine and community-based care are also important aspects of their healthcare system.
That's an interesting point. I've heard that traditional medicine is still widely practiced in many Pacific Island countries, including Nauru. But, in terms of access to quality care, don't you think Denmark's public healthcare system is more comprehensive?
Well, Mira, it's not that simple. While Denmark's system is more comprehensive, Nauru's healthcare system has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. For example, Nauru has a high level of healthcare worker density, with many trained healthcare professionals per capita.
That's impressive. I didn't know that. But what about the quality of care? I've heard that Denmark's healthcare system is known for its high-quality care, with short waiting times and easy access to specialized care.
Yes, that's true. Denmark's healthcare system is indeed known for its high-quality care. But in Nauru, the quality of care can vary depending on the specific service and the healthcare provider. However, there are initiatives underway to improve the quality of care in Nauru, including the development of a national health plan.
I see. Well, it's clear that both countries have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to healthcare. But in terms of access to quality care, I think Denmark's public healthcare system is more comprehensive.
I agree, Mira. However, it's essential to remember that healthcare systems are complex and multifaceted. And there's more to access to quality care than just the number of healthcare providers or the quality of care.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's essential to consider the cultural and economic factors that influence access to quality care. In Denmark, for example, the emphasis on preventive care and community-based services is a key aspect of their healthcare system.
Yes, that's true. And in Norway, the emphasis on traditional medicine and community-based care is also an important aspect of their healthcare system. It's all about finding a balance between traditional and modern healthcare approaches.
I see. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. But what about our listeners? Do you think Denmark's public healthcare system is more comprehensive than Nauru's? Let us know in the comments.
Absolutely, Mira. And don't forget to share your own experiences with healthcare in either country. We'd love to hear about it.
And remember, our listeners, if you think we've missed anything or if you'd like to share more about healthcare in Denmark or Nauru, please leave a comment below.
That's all for now. Folks, thanks for tuning into this episode of our podcast. Join us next time for more discussions on healthcare and beyond.
All right, let's dive into transportation, infrastructure, and convenience in Denmark and Nauru. I bet our listeners in Denmark are familiar with Copenhagen's efficient public transit system. Leo, what do you think about Denmark's bike-friendly roads?
Yes. Denmark's bike infrastructure is legendary. I once rode a bike through the city and thought, this is how cities should be designed. But let's be real. Mira, Nauru's transportation scene is a different story altogether. I mean, have you heard about the country's only international airport, which is essentially a tiny airstrip?
That's a great point. I've read that Nauru's airport is one of the smallest in the world. But Denmark's public transportation is impressive, with buses and trains covering most of the country. I bet our listeners in Denmark have some favorite routes or commuter stories to share.
Well, Mira, I'm sure our Danish listeners do. But Nauru's transportation challenges are more about connectivity than infrastructure. The country's remote location makes it difficult to access, and the airport is often shut down due to weather conditions. It's like trying to reach a tiny island in the middle of nowhere.
That's a good analogy. Leo, and speaking of connectivity, Denmark has invested heavily in its rail network, making it easy to travel between cities. But Nauru's transportation system is mostly dependent on small planes and boats. I wonder if our listeners in Nauru have any stories about traveling by boat or plane in the country.
Well, Mira, I'm sure our listeners in Nauru do. But let's talk about Denmark's bike-sharing systems, which are incredibly popular. I've seen people riding bikes with kids on the back, and it's just a lovely scene. But Nauru's bike-friendly roads? Not so much.
Fair point. I've read that Nauru's roads are mostly unpaved, making it difficult for bicycles to navigate. But Denmark's transportation infrastructure is well maintained, with many bike lanes and pedestrian-friendly areas. I bet our listeners in Denmark appreciate the emphasis on sustainable transportation.
Absolutely, Mira. And speaking of sustainable transportation, Nauru has made efforts to reduce its carbon footprint by promoting electric vehicles and public transportation. But the country's limited resources make it challenging to implement these initiatives.
That's a great point, Leo. And Denmark's commitment to sustainable transportation is admirable, with many cities promoting electric vehicles and car-sharing schemes. I wonder if our listeners in Nauru have any ideas for improving transportation infrastructure in the country.
Well, Mira, I'm sure our listeners in Nauru do. But let's talk about Denmark's high-speed rail network, which connects major cities in no time. I've taken the train from Copenhagen to Aarhus, and it was a breeze. But Nauru's transportation options are limited, with most people relying on private vehicles or taxis.
That's a good comparison. Leo, I've read that Nauru's taxi services are often unreliable, making it difficult for people to get around. But Denmark's public transportation system is reliable, with many buses and trains running on schedule. I bet our listeners in Denmark have some favorite bus routes or commuter stories to share.
Well, Mira, I'm sure our listeners in Denmark do. But Nauru's transportation challenges are more about infrastructure than scheduling. The country's remote location makes it difficult to access, and the airport is often shut down due to weather conditions.
That's a good point, Leo. And speaking of infrastructure, Denmark's transportation system is well maintained, with many bike lanes and pedestrian-friendly areas. I wonder if our listeners in Nauru have any ideas for improving transportation infrastructure in the country.
Well, Mira, I'm sure our listeners in Nauru do. But let's talk about Denmark's commitment to sustainable transportation, which is inspiring. I've seen many cities promoting electric vehicles and public transportation, and it's a great model for other countries to follow.
Absolutely, Leo. And Nauru's efforts to reduce its carbon footprint are commendable, despite the challenges. I wonder if our listeners in Nauru have any favorite transportation hacks or tips for navigating the country's roads.
Well, Mira, I'm sure our listeners in Nauru do. But let's wrap up this topic by saying that Denmark's transportation infrastructure is a model for other countries to follow. And Nauru's unique transportation challenges are a reminder that every country has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Well said, Leo. And I think our listeners in both countries will appreciate the comparison between Denmark's efficient public transit system and Nauru's transportation challenges. If you've got any favorite transportation hacks or tips for navigating either country's roads, drop a comment below.
Well, Mira, I think we've covered transportation infrastructure and convenience in Denmark and Nauru quite well. But I'm sure our listeners have plenty of stories and tips to share. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments.
Denmark is known for its high level of language proficiency, especially when it comes to English. In fact, 92% of Danes can speak English fluently. I'm not, considering how internal Copenhagen is.
That's impressive. But have you ever tried communicating in Danish? I've been there. And let me tell you, it's a challenge. Even with a decent understanding of the language, you might still struggle to understand the nuances of the Danish accent.
I have to agree, Leo. But what's interesting is that Denmark has a high level of language proficiency. Yet it's still a relatively homogeneous country in terms of language. You won't find many languages spoken alongside Danish in everyday life.
That's true. But it's also a reflection of Denmark's history and cultural identity. The country has a strong sense of national unity, which is reflected in its language. On the other hand, Nauru, our second country, has a very different linguistic landscape.
That's right. Nauru has a much more diverse language profile. In fact, Nauruans speak a unique language called Nauruan, which is part of the Austronesian language family. But what's interesting is that English is also widely spoken in Nauru, especially among the younger population.
That's correct. Nauruans have a strong affinity for English, which is likely due to the country's historical ties with the United Kingdom. But what's striking is that Nauruans have managed to preserve their indigenous language, Nauruan, despite the influence of English.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever encountered any language barriers while traveling to Nauru? I'm sure our listeners who have been to Nauru can relate to this experience.
Actually, I have. Mira, when I first arrived in Nauru, I struggled to communicate with the locals. However, the Nauruan people were incredibly warm and welcoming, and they went out of their way to help me communicate in English. It was a great experience, and I learned a lot about the importance of language and cultural exchange.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, it's clear that language can be a powerful tool for building connections and fostering understanding between cultures. I'm sure our listeners would agree with me on this.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of language, I'm curious to know more about the language learning experiences of our listeners. Have any of you encountered any challenges or triumphs while learning a new language?
Great question. I think it's safe to say that language learning can be a challenging but rewarding experience. For those of you who have learned a new language, please share your stories with us in the comments. We'd love to hear about your experiences.
That's a great idea, Mira. And for those who are interested in learning more about language and culture, we recommend checking out our previous episodes on language learning and cultural immersion.
That's right. Leo, and if you're planning to visit Nauru or Denmark, be sure to learn a few key phrases in the local language. It will make a huge difference in your interactions with the locals and enhance your overall experience.
Absolutely, Mira. Language is a key part of any cultural experience, and it's essential to be respectful and open-minded when interacting with people from different linguistic backgrounds.
Well, this episode on language barriers and ease of communication in Denmark and Nauru. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more exciting episodes and behind-the-scenes content.
And so to dive into cultural diversity and tolerance in our two countries, Denmark and Nauru. Let's start with Denmark, a country known for its high standard of living and social cohesion. But, Leo, I have to say, I was a bit to learn that Denmark has a relatively low percentage of immigrants compared to other European countries.
That's true, Mira. However, Denmark has a unique approach to integrating immigrants, which is often referred to as the Danish model. It emphasizes social inclusion, language training, and job placement. But what I find interesting is that Denmark also has a strong tradition of social welfare, which can sometimes be seen as a double-edged sword.
That's a great point. Leo, social welfare can be a blessing and a curse. But I think what's really impressive about Denmark is its commitment to social harmony. The country has a strong emphasis on community and social cohesion, which is reflected in its festivals and traditions. I mean, who can forget the famous Copenhagen Carnival?
Yes. The Copenhagen Carnival is definitely a highlight of the year. But what I think is even more fascinating is the way Denmark handles conflicts and disputes. The country has a long tradition of mediation and conflict resolution, which is reflected in its emphasis on consensus building and negotiation.
That's so true. Leo, Denmark is known for its ability to navigate complex conflicts and reach mutually beneficial solutions. And I think this is reflected in its approach to cultural diversity. The country has a strong tradition of respecting and celebrating different cultures, which is reflected in its many cultural festivals and events.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think this is where Nauru comes in. As a small island nation with a relatively homogeneous population, Nauru has a unique approach to cultural diversity. The country has a strong tradition of respecting and celebrating its indigenous culture, which is reflected in its many cultural festivals and traditions.
That's so true. Nauru has a rich cultural heritage, and its people are deeply connected to their land and traditions. But I think what's really impressive about Nauru is its commitment to social harmony. The country has a strong emphasis on community and social cohesion, which is reflected in its many community-based initiatives and programs.
Yes. Nauru has a strong sense of community, and its people are known for their hospitality and welcoming nature. And I think this is reflected in the country's approach to cultural diversity. Nauru has a strong tradition of respecting and celebrating different cultures, which is reflected in its many cultural festivals and events.
I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the key to Nauru's success in promoting cultural diversity and tolerance?
Well, Mira, I think it's the country's strong sense of community and social cohesion. Nauru's people are deeply connected to their land and traditions, and this connection is reflected in their approach to cultural diversity.
That's so true, Leo. And I think this is reflected in the country's many community-based initiatives and programs. Nauru has a strong emphasis on community development, which is reflected in its many community-based projects and initiatives.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think this is where Denmark comes in again. Denmark's emphasis on social welfare and community development is reflected in its many community-based initiatives and programs. The country has a strong tradition of supporting community-based projects and initiatives, which is reflected in its many community-based programs and services.
That's so true, Leo. And I think this is where our listeners come in. I'm curious. What do you think about the way Denmark and Nauru approach cultural diversity and tolerance? Do you think there are any lessons that can be learned from these two countries?
Oh, yes. Mira, I think there are many lessons that can be learned from Denmark and Nauru. Both countries have a strong emphasis on social cohesion and community development, which is reflected in their many community-based initiatives and programs.
I'm actually curious about what others think about this. Do you think that Denmark and Nauru's approaches to cultural diversity and tolerance are effective? Should other countries learn from their examples?
Yes. Mira, I think it's a great question. And I think the answer is yes. Denmark and Nauru's approaches to cultural diversity and tolerance are effective, and other countries can definitely learn from their examples.
Well, Estopic, thanks for joining us. Leo, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation about cultural diversity and tolerance in Denmark and Nauru.
Thanks, Mira. It's been a pleasure discussing this topic with you. And I hope our listeners have learned something new and interesting about these two countries.
And so to dive into educational opportunities and language schools in Denmark and Nauru. Let's start with Denmark, shall we? I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of folk high schools in Denmark?
Yes. Mira, those are fascinating institutions that aim to provide students with a more holistic education, focusing on personal growth and social skills. It's like a mix of boarding school and summer camp, but with a Danish twist.
Exactly. And I've heard that these folk high schools are incredibly popular among Danish students. But what about Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational system in this tiny island nation.
Well, Mira, Nauru's education system is quite unique. They have a strong focus on vocational training and have even established a marine training facility to help students develop skills in areas like fishing and aquaculture.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. And I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of free schools in Denmark? These are independent schools that are funded by the government, but have more freedom to innovate and experiment with their teaching methods.
Yes. Mira, free schools are a big deal in Denmark. They're like the Scandinavian version of charter schools, but with a more emphasis on creativity and student choice. And I've heard that they're incredibly effective in helping students from disadvantaged backgrounds.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the language acquisition process in Denmark. Do you think it's easier for foreigners to learn Danish compared to other languages?
That's a great question. Mira, I think Danish can be a bit challenging for foreigners, but the Danes are known for being very welcoming and helpful. And with the rise of language learning apps and online resources, it's easier than ever to learn Danish from the comfort of your own home.
That's true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the language learning opportunities in Nauru. Do you think it's possible for foreigners to learn Nauruan, the local language?
Good question. Mira, Nauruan is a bit of a challenge for foreigners, but it's definitely possible to learn. And with the help of language learning apps and online resources, it's easier than ever to get started.
That's great to hear. And I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of language immersion in Denmark? This is where students are encouraged to speak the language as much as possible, even outside of class.
Yes. Mira, language immersion is a big deal in Denmark, and I've heard that it's incredibly effective in helping students improve their language skills. But it can also be a bit challenging for students who are not used to speaking the language outside of class.
That's true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational strengths of Denmark. What do you think sets Denmark apart from other countries in terms of education?
Well, Mira, I think Denmark's emphasis on social skills and personal growth is unique. And their focus on vocational training and apprenticeships is also incredibly effective in preparing students for the workforce.
That's a great point. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational challenges facing Nauru. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Nauru's education system?
Good question. Mira, I think one of the biggest challenges facing Nauru's education system is the lack of resources and infrastructure. But despite these challenges, the Norwegians are known for their resilience and determination.
That's true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational opportunities available to students in Nauru. What do you think are some of the best ways for students to access education in Nauru?
Well, Mira, I think one of the best ways for students to access education in Nauru is through online resources and language learning apps. And I've heard that the Nauruan government is also working to establish more vocational training programs to help students develop skills in areas like fishing and aquaculture.
That's great to hear. And I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of education for sustainable development in Denmark? This is where students are encouraged to think critically about the impact of their actions on the environment.
Yes. Mira. Education for sustainable development is a big deal in Denmark, and I've heard that it's incredibly effective in helping students develop the skills they need to address some of the world's most pressing environmental challenges.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational opportunities available to students in Nauru. What do you think are some of the best ways for students to access education in Nauru?
Well, Mira, I think one of the best ways for students to access education in Nauru is through online resources and language learning apps. And I've heard that the Nauruan government is also working to establish more vocational training programs to help students develop skills in areas like fishing and aquaculture.
Great to hear. And I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of inclusive education in Denmark? This is where students with disabilities are encouraged to participate fully in the learning process.
Yes. Mira, inclusive education is a big deal in Denmark, and I've heard that it's incredibly effective in helping students with disabilities develop the skills they need to succeed in school and beyond.
That's wonderful to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational strengths of Nauru. What do you think sets Nauru apart from other countries in terms of education?
Well, Mira, I think Nauru's emphasis on vocational training and apprenticeships is unique, and their focus on marine conservation and sustainable fishing practices is also incredibly important in the Pacific region.
That's a great point. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational challenges facing Denmark. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Denmark's education system?
Good question. Mira, I think one of the biggest challenges facing Denmark's education system is the need for greater diversity and inclusivity. And I've heard that the Danish government is working to address these challenges through initiatives like language immersion and vocational training programs.
That's true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the educational opportunities available to students in Denmark. What do you think are some of the best ways for students to access education in Denmark?
Well, Mira, I think one of the best ways for students to access education in Denmark is through language immersion programs and vocational training initiatives.
So, let's talk about climate and seasonal conditions in Denmark and Nauru. I'm sure our listeners would love to know about the temperature fluctuations in these two countries.
That's right. Mira, Denmark is known for its mild climate, with temperatures ranging from 30 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius throughout the year. But what about Nauru? Mira, how does its climate compare?
Well, Nauru is actually one of the smallest countries in the world, and it has a tropical climate, with temperatures usually ranging from 25 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius. But what's interesting is that Nauru is one of the countries that's most vulnerable to climate change.
That's right. Mira, Nauru is located in the Pacific Ocean, and it's susceptible to extreme weather events like cyclones and droughts. Denmark, on the other hand, has a more stable climate, but it's still affected by climate change, especially in the form of rising sea levels.
Yes, and I'm curious to know, Leo, have you ever experienced a cyclone in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about it.
Well, Mia, I've actually been to Nauru a few times, and I can tell you that it's a beautiful country, but the weather can be quite unpredictable. But I have to say, the locals are very resilient and adapt quickly to the changing climate conditions.
That's great to hear, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that adapting to climate change is crucial, especially in countries like Nauru that are highly vulnerable. Now, let's talk about the seasonal conditions in both countries. In Denmark, we have 4 distinct seasons, with winter being the coldest and darkest time of the year.
That's right, Mira. And in Nauru, the seasonal conditions are much more extreme, with the country experiencing the main seasons, the dry season and the wet season. The dry season is from May to October, and it's characterized by hot temperatures and dry air.
Wow, that sounds quite extreme, Leo. And I'm curious to know, have you ever experienced the wet season in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about it.
Well, Mira, I have to say that the wet season in Nauru is quite an adventure. The rain can be quite intense, and the roads can become flooded. But the locals are very resourceful and adapt quickly to the changing conditions.
That's great to hear, Leon. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that adapting to climate change is crucial, especially in countries like Nauru that are highly vulnerable. Now, let's talk about the local adaptations in both countries. In Denmark, we have a very advanced waste management system, with a focus on recycling and reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
That's right, Mira. And in Nauru, the local adaptations are quite different, with the country focusing on sustainable land management and climate-resilient agriculture. The government has also implemented programs to reduce the country's carbon footprint and promote renewable energy.
Wow, that's impressive. Leo, and I'm curious to know, what do you think is the most effective way to adapt to climate change in countries like Nauru?
Well, Nira, I think that's a great question. And I believe that a combination of both local and international efforts is needed to address the climate change crisis. In Nauru, for example, the government has implemented programs to promote sustainable land management and climate-resilient agriculture. But more needs to be done to address the root causes of climate change.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that addressing the root causes of climate change is crucial. Now, let's talk about the impact of climate change on the daily lives of people in both countries. In Denmark, we have a very high standard of living, and the impact of climate change is quite minimal compared to other countries.
That's right, Mira. But in Nauru, the impact of climate change is quite significant, with the country experiencing frequent droughts and floods, which affect the daily lives of people. The country also struggles with a lack of access to clean water and sanitation, which exacerbates the impact of climate change.
Wow, that's a stark contrast. Leo, and I'm curious to know, what do you think is the most important thing that people in Nauru can do to adapt to climate change?
Well, Mira, I think that's a great question, and I believe that education and awareness are key to addressing the climate change crisis. In Nauru, for example, the government has implemented programs to educate the public about the importance of climate change adaptation and mitigation.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that education and awareness are crucial in addressing the climate change crisis. Well, as topic on climate and seasonal conditions in Denmark and Nauru, I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation and learned something new about these two countries.
Well, Mira, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. And I'm sure our listeners have gained a better understanding of the climate and seasonal conditions in both countries. Thanks for having me on the show. Mira!
I'm sure our listeners are eager to dive into the fascinating world of food culture and nutritional alternatives in Denmark and Nauru. Let's start with Denmark, a country famous for its love of food, particularly pastries and bread. I mean, have you tried a Danish pastry? Leo? They're flaky, buttery, and oh so delicious.
Mira, you're making me hungry just about it. Denmark's pastry game is indeed strong. But let's not forget about the country's commitment to sustainability on reducing food waste. They had a fantastic initiative called Eugen's Ret, which encourages people to use up leftover food and reduce waste. I'm curious. Mira, have you ever tried making a traditional Danish SM or RBRD with leftover bread?
Actually, Leo, I have tried making SM or ABRD, and it's a game changer. The combination of pickled red cabbage, boiled eggs, and cold cuts on top of toasted bread is absolute perfection. But I digress. Let's talk about Nauru, a country with a unique food culture shaped by its Pacific Island heritage. I'm fascinated by the use of coconuts and fish in Nauru's traditional cuisine. Have you ever tried a Nauru-style coconut curry? Leo?
Coconut curry sounds amazing. I've had my fair share of Pacific Island cuisine, and I can attest to the deliciousness of coconut-based dishes. But what I find fascinating about Nauru is the impact of climate change on the country's food security. Rising sea levels and changing weather patterns are affecting the availability of fresh produce and fish, making it challenging for locals to access nutritious food. I'm curious. Mira, what do you think are some innovative solutions to address this issue?
Excellent question. Leo? I believe that sustainable agriculture and vertical farming could be key solutions to address food security in Nauru. By using hydroponics and other innovative techniques, locals can grow fresh produce year-round, even in challenging climate conditions. And let's not forget about the importance of community-led initiatives, such as the Nauru Women's Association, which is working to promote sustainable food systems and empower women in the community. If you think this is a great initiative, please let us know in the comments.
I completely agree with you. Mira, community-led initiatives are crucial in addressing food security challenges, and I'm glad you mentioned the importance of empowering women in the community. In Denmark, we also have a strong focus on women's empowerment and sustainable food systems. In fact, the country has a thriving community of female farmers and chefs who are working together to promote sustainable agriculture and reduce food waste. I'm curious. Mira, have you ever tried any of the delicious Danish foods made with foraged ingredients, such as wild berries or mushrooms?
Oh, Leo, you're making me want to try foraging for wild berries. In Denmark, foraging is a popular activity, and many people enjoy picking wild berries and mushrooms to make delicious jams, preserves, and sauces. And let's not forget about the importance of preserving traditional knowledge and cultural heritage through food. In Nauru, for example, traditional dishes like coconut crab and breadfruit are not only delicious, but also hold significant cultural and historical value. I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the role of food in preserving cultural heritage?
That's a great question. Mira, I believe that food plays a vital role in preserving cultural heritage, especially in Pacific Island cultures like Nauru. Traditional dishes and ingredients are often tied to specific events, ceremonies, and stories, making food an integral part of the community's history and identity. And I'm glad you mentioned the importance of preserving traditional knowledge and cultural heritage through food. In Denmark, we also have a strong focus on preserving traditional food culture and promoting cultural heritage through food-related events and festivals. If you've ever attended a Danish food festival, please share your experience in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about Danish food festivals. And speaking of festivals, I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried any of the unique foods at Nauru's annual Independence Day celebrations? I've heard that the traditional dish of coconut crab is a crowd favorite. But I'm also intrigued by the use of local ingredients like pandanus and taro in traditional Nauru dishes.
Pandanus and taro sound delicious. I've had my fair share of Pacific Island cuisine, but I'm always eager to try new flavors and ingredients. And I must say, Mira, you're making me hungry just about Nauru's traditional dishes. But let's not forget about the importance of food safety and handling in both Denmark and Nauru. In Denmark, we have a strong focus on food safety and handling, with many restaurants and food establishments prioritizing sustainable and responsible food practices. I'm curious, Mira, what do you think are some key takeaways from Denmark's approach to food safety and handling?
Excellent question. Leo, I believe that Denmark's approach to food safety and handling is centered around transparency, sustainability, and community engagement. By prioritizing sustainable and responsible food practices, Danish restaurants and food establishments can not only ensure food safety, but also promote a positive impact on the environment in the community. And let's not forget about the importance of cultural exchange and sharing knowledge between countries. If you think there's a valuable lesson to be learned from Denmark's approach to food safety and handling, please share your thoughts in the comments.
I completely agree with you. Mira, cultural exchange and sharing knowledge between countries are essential in promoting sustainable food systems and addressing food security challenges. And I must say, our listeners are probably eager to try some of the delicious foods we've discussed today. If you're a foodie, please let us know in the comments what your favorite Danish or Nauru dish is, and we'll feature it in our next episode.
Thanks for the plug, Leo. And speaking of plugs, I'm curious, Leo, have you ever tried any of the innovative food technologies in Denmark, such as vertical farming or robotic food processing? I've heard that these technologies are revolutionizing the food industry and promoting sustainable food systems.
Yes. I have tried some of the innovative food technologies in Denmark, and I must say, they're fascinating. From vertical farming to robotic food processing, these technologies are changing the way we produce and consume food. And I'm glad you mentioned the importance of innovation in promoting sustainable food systems. In Nauru, we're also exploring innovative solutions to address food security challenges, such as aquaponics and hydroponics. If you think these technologies are the future of food, please share your thoughts in the comments.
Denmark has a rich history dating back to the Viking Age, with landmarks like the Roskilde Cathedral and the Kolding HUS Castle showcasing its medieval past.
The Vikings. Those fierce warriors. Plundering and pillaging their way across Europe. I loves uncovering stories like this. And so do we. Mira.
And Nauru, on the other hand, has a unique history as a phosphate-rich island that became a major player in the phosphate trade. Its strategic location made it a coveted spot for many powers throughout history.
That's right. Mira, Nauru's history is a fascinating tale of colonialism and exploitation. But let's not forget about Denmark's cultural heritage, which includes the famous Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen.
Tivoli Gardens. It's like a fairy tale come to life, with its colorful buildings and lively atmosphere. But Nauru has its own unique cultural traditions, like the Nauru and dance, which is a fusion of traditional and modern styles.
I love how Nauru's culture is a blend of traditional and modern elements. It's like a delicious fusion of flavors, just like a Danish pastry. And speaking of flavors, have you tried the traditional Danish pastry? Yeah.
Oh, Leo, you're always trying to distract me with food. But I have tried it, and it's delicious. But let's get back to Nauru's artistic scene. I'm told that Nauru has a thriving arts community, with many talented artists creating beautiful works.
That's right. Mira, Nauru's art scene is a vibrant and dynamic community that's making waves in the Pacific. And Denmark, of course, has a long tradition of artistic excellence, from the famous painter, Hygge, to the modern-day installations at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art.
The Louisiana Museum of Modern Art. It's like a treasure trove of modern art, with its stunning architecture and beautiful gardens. And speaking of gardens, Nauru's tropical climate makes it a paradise for gardeners and nature lovers.
You're always making connections between Denmark and Nauru. Mira, but I have to agree with you. Both countries have a deep appreciation for nature and the outdoors. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that there's something special about experiencing the beauty of nature in a unique and untouched environment.
That's right. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners would also agree that there's something special about experiencing the rich cultural heritage of Denmark and Nauru. So, let's take a look at some of the historical landmarks in Denmark, like the Kronborg Castle, which is said to be the inspiration for Elsinore and Shakespeare's Hamlet.
Ah, Kronborg Castle. It's like a real-life fairy tale, complete with its grand halls and towers. And speaking of fairy tales, Nauru has its own unique stories and legends, like the story of the Nauruan goddess, who is said to have created the island.
Oh, Leo, you're always spinning tales. But seriously, Nauru's cultural heritage is a fascinating topic, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. So, let's take a closer look at some of the cultural traditions in Nauru, like the traditional Nauru and Ants, which is a beautiful and intricate performance.
That's right. Mira, the Nauru and Ants is a stunning display of color and movement. And it's a great example of the country's rich cultural heritage. And Denmark, of course, has its own unique cultural traditions, like the traditional Danish folk dance, which is a lively and energetic performance.
Ah, the traditional Danish folk dance. It's like a party on stage, with its lively music and colorful costumes. And speaking of parties, Nauru has its own unique celebrations, like the Independence Day celebrations, which are a big deal in the country.
You're always making connections between Denmark and Nauru. Mira, but I have to agree with you. Both countries have a deep appreciation for celebrations and festivities. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that there's something special about experiencing the vibrant culture of Denmark and Nauru.
That's right, Leah. And I'm sure our listeners would also agree that there's something special about experiencing the rich historical and cultural heritage of Denmark and Nauru. So, let's take a look at some of the art scenes in Denmark and Nauru, like the famous Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, which is a hub for artistic and cultural expression.
Ah, Tivoli Gardens. It's like a fairy tale come to life, with its colorful buildings and lively atmosphere. And speaking of art, Nauru has its own unique artistic traditions, like the traditional Nauru and wood carvings, which are a beautiful and intricate art form.
Ah, the traditional Nauru and wood carvings. They're like a work of art, with their intricate designs and patterns. And speaking of art, Denmark has its own unique artistic traditions, like the famous Danish design, which is a blend of modern and traditional styles.
You're always making connections between Denmark and Nauru. Mira, but I have to agree with you. Both countries have a deep appreciation for art and design, and I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that there's something special about experiencing the vibrant culture of Denmark and Nauru.
That's right, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would also agree that there's something special about experiencing the rich historical and cultural heritage of Denmark and Nauru. So, let's take a look at some of the unique cultural traditions in Denmark and Nauru, like the traditional Danish folk dance and energetic performance.
Ah, the traditional Danish folk dance. It's like a party on stage, with its lively music and colorful costumes. And speaking of parties, Nauru has its own unique celebrations, like the Independence Day celebrations, which are a big deal in the country.
Ah, the Independence Day celebrations. They're like a big party, with its music and dancing and colorful costumes. And speaking of costumes, Denmark has its own unique traditional clothing, like the traditional Danish bonad, which is a beautiful and intricate garment.
You're always making connections between Denmark and Nauru. Mira! But I have to agree with you. Both countries have a deep appreciation for cultural heritage and tradition. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that there's something special about experiencing the rich culture of Denmark and Nauru.
I'm absolutely in love with Denmark's stunning coastline, especially the cliffs of MN and the scenic Anibare Bay. The combination of rugged cliffs, sandy beaches, and crystal clear waters is just breathtaking. Have you ever been to Denmark, Leah?
Ah, yes. Denmark. The land of Hans Christian Andersen and the happiest people on earth. But let's talk about Nauru, shall we? I mean, who needs Denmark's scenic coastline when you have the world's smallest island nation? Nauru's landscape is like a miniature version of a tropical paradise.
Well, I think Denmark's coastline is pretty unique. Leo, and have you seen the famous Little Mermaid statue in Copenhagen? It's a must-see attraction for any traveler. By the way, I'm curious. Have you ever tried surfing in Denmark?
Ha! Surfing in Denmark? I think you'll find that the waves are a bit too calm for that. But Nauru's got its own unique surfing experience, well, more like trying to catch a wave in a tiny island with no waves. Really? Just kidding. But seriously, Nauru's landscape is dotted with remnants of phosphate mining, which gives it a rather industrial look.
That's an interesting point. Leo, but let's forget about Denmark's beautiful forests, like the Skovklint Ninjen forest in the north. The Danes have done an amazing job of preserving their natural beauty. And I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me on that.
Indeed they would. Mira, but Nauru's unique landscape is also home to the world's first ever island nation to be completely destroyed by human activity. I'm talking about the phosphate mining. It's like a ghost town, but with a tropical twist.
I see what you mean. But Denmark's also got a lot of history, with ancient Viking ruins and medieval castles. And have you ever tried visiting the stunning Roskilde Cathedral, a UNESCO World Heritage Site?
Ah, yes. Roskilde Cathedral is indeed a stunning piece of architecture. But let's get back to Nauru. It's got its own unique geological features, like the Nauru phosphate mine, which is now a massive crater. It's like a giant hole in the ground, but with a tropical atmosphere.
That's a unique feature. All right. But Denmark's also got a lot of natural wonders, like the stunning waterfalls of the SKJ or Eldungen Fjord. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about Nauru's natural beauty. Don't you think, Leo?
Well, Mira, I think we've covered a lot of ground, or rather, a lot of water. But seriously, Nauru's got its own unique charm, with its tropical climate and stunning sunsets. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Denmark and Nauru are worth visiting.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's time for us to wrap up this criterion. But before we go, I just want to say that I'm curious about what our listeners think about this comparison. Do you think Denmark's coastline is more breathtaking than Nauru's unique landscape? Let us know in the comments below.
Well, I think we've sparked some interesting debate, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will have a lot to say about this comparison. But for now, let's just say that both Denmark and Nauru are truly special in their own unique ways.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this criterion. But before we move on to the next topic, I just want to say that I'm to explore more of Nauru's natural beauty. Who knows, maybe we'll discover some hidden gems.
Ah, yes, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners are eagerly waiting to hear more about Nauru's natural wonders. But for now, let's just say that we've only scratched the surface of this fascinating island nation.
I think that's all for this criterion. But before we go, I just want to say that I'm curious about what our listeners think about Nauru's unique landscape. Do you think it's more fascinating than Denmark's coastline? Let us know in the comments below.
Well, I think we've sparked some interesting debate, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will have a lot to say about this comparison. But for now, let's just say that both Denmark and Nauru are truly special in their own unique ways.
So, let's talk about Denmark and Nauru when it comes to sports, activity, and adventure options. I'm curious, Leo, what comes to mind when you think of Denmark in this regard?
Well, Mira, I think of cycling. Denmark is famous for its cycling culture, and I've heard that Copenhagen has some of the most bike-friendly streets in the world. In fact, I've even seen people riding their bikes with their little ones in tow, just like in a scene from a Disney movie.
That's hilarious. I can just imagine. But seriously, cycling is a great way to explore the city. And speaking of exploring, Have you heard about the concept of HYGCE in Denmark? It's all about embracing coziness and slowing down, which is perfect for outdoor activities like cycling or walking in nature.
HYGGE? Huh? I think I can relate to that. But let's talk about something more extreme, like adventure sports. In Nauru, I've heard that surfing is a popular activity, especially during the wet season. I mean, who wouldn't want to surf in the Pacific Ocean with crystal clear waters and coral reefs?
Oh, that sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think surfing in Nauru would be a thrill or a challenge? Let us know in the comments. And Leo, I have to ask, have you ever tried surfing before?
Well, Mia, I'm more of a stand-up comedian than a surfer. But I've tried it once or twice. Let's just say it was an interesting experience. But I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about it. Maybe I'll have to write a stand-up routine about it.
That would be hilarious. And speaking of adventure sports, I've heard that Denmark has some amazing opportunities for hiking and exploring its beautiful countryside. Have you ever been to the cliffs of MN? Leo?
Actually, Mira, I have been to the cliffs of MN. It's breathtaking, isn't it? The way the cliffs meet the sea is just incredible. And I've heard that the hiking trails in Denmark are some of the best in the world.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that sets Denmark apart from other countries. It's just so easy to get outdoors and explore nature. But I have to... Leo? What about Nauru? I've heard that it's a bit more challenging to get around, especially with limited infrastructure.
That's a good point. Mira, Nauru does have limited infrastructure, but that doesn't mean there aren't adventure opportunities. In fact, I've heard that the country has some amazing opportunities for fishing and snorkeling in its coral reefs.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that. And speaking of fishing, I heard that Denmark has some great fishing spots, especially in the Baltic Sea. Have you ever been fishing in Denmark? Leo?
Well, Mira, I'm more of a fish out of water in a fishing situation. But I've gone fishing in Denmark. Let's just say it was a memorable experience.
That's so funny. And I think that's one of the things that makes this conversation so fun. We're just sharing our experiences and trying to learn more about each other's countries.
That's exactly right, Mira. And I think that's what makes this podcast so great. We're just having a conversation about two amazing countries and trying to learn more about each other.
And speaking of learning, I'm curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think there's a connection between the outdoor lifestyle in Denmark and the adventure sports in Nauru? Let us know in the comments.
Well, Mira, I think there is a connection. I think that both Denmark and Nauru offer a unique perspective on the great outdoors. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's one of the things that sets these two countries apart. They offer a unique perspective on the great outdoors. And that's something that our listeners can definitely appreciate.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, Mira. But before we go, let's talk about something that I think is really important. Have you ever heard about the concept of FR-Loftes-liv in Denmark?
FR-Loftes-liv? What's that?
Well, it's a concept that's all about embracing the great outdoors and living life to the fullest. And I think that's something that we can all learn from, no matter where we're from.
That's a great point. And I think that's one of the things that makes this conversation so great. We're just sharing our experiences and trying to learn more about each other's cultures.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, Mira. But before we go, let's talk about something that I think is really important. Have you ever heard about the concept of FR-Loftes-liv in Denmark?
Well, Leo, I think you've already mentioned that concept, but I'll let you try again.
Well, I guess I did mention it earlier. But seriously, Mira, I think that FR-Loftes-liv is a concept that's really important for our listeners to understand. It's all about embracing the great outdoors and living life to the fullest.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's one of the things that sets Denmark apart from other countries. It's just so easy to get outdoors and explore nature.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Mira, But before we go, let's talk about something that I think is really important. Have you ever heard about the concept of FRI love test live in Denmark?
Leo, stop repeating yourself.
Okay, Mira. Oh, stop. But seriously, I think that FRI love test live is a concept that's really important for our listeners to understand.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's one of the things that makes. I'm sure our listeners would agree that the nightlife in Denmark is quite unique. The capital city, Copenhagen, has a lively atmosphere, with everything from cozy bars to vibrant clubs.
That's right. Mira, Copenhagen's nightlife is a fusion of old and new. You can find traditional Danish taverns serving traditional pub food, but also modern cocktail bars and clubs that cater to all tastes.
I've heard that the city's famous Tivoli Gardens is a must-visit for anyone interested in nightlife. It's not just a theme park, but also a vibrant entertainment district with restaurants, bars, and music venues.
Tivoli Gardens is indeed an iconic part of Copenhagen's nightlife. And, of course, who can forget about the famous Nightlife Harbor, which is lined with bars, restaurants, and nightclubs?
I'm curious. Have you ever been to a traditional Danish HYGCG bar? You know, those cozy bars where everyone is just sitting around, enjoying a drink and some good company.
Ah, yes. I have been to a few of those. They're a great way to experience the Danish concept of HYGCE, which is all about coziness and warmth. But, let's be real. Mira, Denmark's nightlife is not all about cozy bars. There's also a vibrant club scene in Copenhagen.
That's true, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the club scene in Copenhagen. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Well, Copenhagen has a great selection of clubs, from underground techno clubs to mainstream dance clubs. And, of course, there's also the famous St. Street, which is one of the longest shopping streets in Europe, but also a hub for nightlife.
I see. And what about Nauru? I'm sure our listeners are curious about the nightlife scene in this small island nation.
Ah, yes, Nauru. Well, let's just say that Nauru's nightlife is a bit more laid back. There aren't many options for going out, but the locals have a great time at the few bars and clubs that are available.
I can imagine. So it's a bit of a challenge for tourists to find things to do at night in Nauru, right?
That's right, Mira. But, hey, it's not all there. Nauru has a great sense of community, and the locals are very welcoming to visitors. And, who knows, you might even find a hidden gem or two.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the nightlife in Nauru. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Well, as I said, there aren't many options for going out, but the locals have a great time at the few bars and clubs that are available. And, of course, there's also the famous Nauru International Market, which is a great place to try some local cuisine and drinks.
I see. And what about the music scene in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it.
The music scene in Nauru is a bit more underground, but there are some great local musicians and DJs who are making waves in the community. And, of course, there's also the famous Nauru Cultural Festival, which is a great way to experience the local culture and music.
That sounds great. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural festival.
Well, the festival is a great way to experience the local culture and music. And, of course, there's also the famous Nauru traditional dance, which is a great way to experience the local traditions.
I see. And what about the food and drink scene in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it.
Ah, yes. The food and drink scene in Nauru is a bit more limited, but there are some great local options available. And, of course, there's also the famous Nauru seafood, which is a great way to try some fresh seafood.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the seafood in Nauru.
Well, the seafood in Nauru is some of the freshest and best in the Pacific. And, Of course, there's also the famous Nauru coconut crab, which is a great way to try some local cuisine.
I see. And what about the accommodation options in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about them.
Ah, yes. The accommodation options in Nauru are a bit more basic, but there are some great options available, including the famous Nauru Hotel, which is a great place to stay.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the hotel.
Well, the hotel is a great place to stay, with comfortable rooms and a great restaurant serving local cuisine.
I see. And what about the activities and attractions in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about them.
Ah, yes. The activities and attractions in Nauru are a bit more limited, but there are some great options available, including the famous Nauru National Museum, which is a great place to learn about the local history and culture.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the museum.
Well, the museum is a great place to learn about the local history and culture, and it's also a great way to experience the local traditions.
I see. And what about the outdoor activities in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about them.
Ah, yes. The outdoor activities in Nauru are a bit more limited, but there are some great options available, including the famous Nauru National Park, which is a great place to see some of the island's unique wildlife.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the national park.
Well, the national park is a great place to see some of the island's unique wildlife, and it's also a great way to experience the local environment.
I see. And finally, what about the safety and security in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it.
Ah, yes. The safety and security in Nauru are a bit of a concern, but the locals are generally friendly and welcoming to visitors. And, of course, there's also the famous Nauru Police, which is a great way to experience the local law enforcement.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the police.
Well, the police in Nauru are generally friendly and welcoming to visitors, and they also provide a great service to the local community.
I'm certain that our listeners living in these two countries would agree with me that family-friendly environments and children's activities are crucial for a country's charm. Let's start with Denmark, shall we? Denmark's capital, Copenhagen, is a treasure trove for families, with its picturesque parks, playgrounds, and kid-friendly museums.
Ah, yes. Copenhagen is indeed a paradise for families. I've heard that the city has an impressive number of playgrounds, over 300, to be exact. And these playgrounds are not just any ordinary playgrounds. They're designed with safety and fun in mind, featuring unique play structures and equipment.
That's fantastic. And I've also read that Denmark has a strong focus on children's welfare and education. In fact, the country has implemented a program to support families and children, including initiatives like the Children's Welfare Act and the Act on the Placement of Children.
Ah, yes. The Children's Welfare Act is a remarkable piece of legislation that prioritizes the well-being and development of children. And it's not just about the law. Denmark also has a strong culture of supporting families through community-based initiatives and programs.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever visited any of these playgrounds or museums in Copenhagen? What was your experience like?
Ah, yes. I've had the pleasure of visiting the Tivoli Gardens, one of the oldest amusement parks in the world. And it's a must-visit for families. The park is filled with colorful rides, games, and attractions that cater to all ages. And the best part, the park is open year-round, even in the winter, with a magical winter wonderland atmosphere.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Tivoli Gardens. And speaking of family-friendly activities, what about Nauru? I've heard that the country has a unique approach to family life.
Ah, yes. Nauru is indeed a country with a strong focus on family and community. The country has a relatively small population, and as a result, the community is close-knit, with a strong emphasis on family values and traditions.
That's fascinating. I've also read that Nauru has a unique approach to education, with a focus on traditional knowledge and cultural practices. In fact, The country has implemented a program to revitalize the Nauru and language and culture.
Ah, yes. The program to revitalize the Nauru and language and culture is a remarkable initiative that aims to preserve the country's rich cultural heritage. And it's not just about language. The program also includes traditional music, dance, and art.
I'm curious. Have you ever learned about any of these traditional practices or languages? What was your experience like?
Yes. I've had the pleasure of learning about some of the traditional practices and languages of Nauru, and it's been a fascinating experience. The country's rich cultural heritage is truly unique and worth exploring.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Nauru's cultural practices and traditions. And speaking of family-friendly environments, what about the country's parks and playgrounds? Are they as impressive as those in Denmark?
Yes. Nauru's parks and playgrounds are indeed impressive, with a strong focus on community-based initiatives and programs. The country's small size means that families can easily access parks and playgrounds, and the community is always willing to help out.
That's wonderful to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Nauru's family-friendly environment. And finally, let's talk about the unique aspects of each country's family-friendly approach. What do you think sets Denmark and Nauru apart from other countries in terms of family-friendly environments and children's activities?
Yes. Denmark's approach to family-friendly environments is truly unique, with a focus on community-based initiatives and programs that support families and children. And Nauru's approach is also unique, with a strong emphasis on traditional knowledge and cultural practices that preserve the country's rich cultural heritage.
I think that's a great point. Leo, both countries have a unique approach to family-friendly environments and children's activities, and it's fascinating to see how they support families and children in different ways.
Yes. And I think that's what makes these two countries so special. They offer a glimpse into different approaches to family-friendly environments and children's activities, and it's up to us to learn from them and implement similar initiatives in our own communities.
I'm sure our listeners would agree with us that family-friendly environments and children's activities are crucial for a country's charm. And it's up to us to spread the word about these amazing countries and their unique approaches to family-friendly environments and children's activities.
Yes. And finally, let's hear from our listeners. What do you think about Denmark and Nauru's family environments and children's activities? Do you have any tips or recommendations for families visiting these countries? Let us know in the comments below.
So let's dive into the LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Denmark, shall we? I'm sure our listeners in Denmark would agree that Copenhagen is one of the most vibrant and inclusive cities in the world.
Absolutely. Mira, Denmark has a reputation for being one of the most progressive countries in the world when it comes to LGBT rights. And Copenhagen's Pride event is definitely one of the highlights of the year.
That's right. Copenhagen's Pride is a huge celebration of diversity and inclusivity. And did you know that Denmark was one of the first countries to introduce same-sex marriage in 2012?
Wow, that's impressive. And it's not just the laws that are progressive. Mira, the Danish society is also very accepting and welcoming of LGBT individuals. I'm sure our listeners have heard about the famous Dyke March in Copenhagen.
Yes. The Dyke March is a hilarious and iconic event that celebrates the lesbian community in Copenhagen. I'm sure it's a highlight of the Pride celebrations every year.
And speaking of Pride celebrations, I'm curious to know, Mira, what do you think is the most important aspect of creating an LGBT-friendly atmosphere in a country like Denmark?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's all about creating a sense of community and inclusivity. Denmark has a strong culture of acceptance and tolerance, which is reflected in its laws and social norms.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Denmark has a strong tradition of promoting LGBT rights through education and awareness-raising campaigns.
Yes. Education is key to promoting acceptance and inclusivity. And Denmark has done a great job of incorporating LGBT education into its school curriculum.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that education is essential for creating a more inclusive society. And speaking of inclusivity, Mira, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of creating a LGBT-friendly atmosphere in a country like Denmark?
That's a tough one. Leo, I think one of the biggest challenges is addressing the remaining pockets of intolerance and prejudice in Danish society.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Denmark has a relatively small population, which can sometimes make it difficult to address these issues.
That's true, Leo. But I think Denmark has done a great job of using its small size to its advantage. By promoting a sense of community and inclusivity, the country has been able to create a strong and supportive environment for LGBT individuals.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of community, I'm curious to know, what do you think is the most important aspect of creating a strong and supportive LGBT community in a country like Denmark?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's all about creating a sense of belonging and connection among LGBT individuals.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Denmark has a strong tradition of promoting LGBT community engagement and participation in local politics.
Yes. Community engagement is key to creating a more inclusive and supportive society. And Denmark has done a great job of promoting LGBT community engagement through various initiatives and campaigns.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that community engagement is essential for creating a more inclusive society. And speaking of inclusivity, Mira, what do you think is the most significant difference between Denmark and Nauru in terms of LGBT rights?
That's a great question. Leo, I think one of the biggest differences is the level of acceptance and tolerance in Danish society compared to Nauru.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Nauru has a relatively conservative and traditional society, which can make it more challenging to promote LGBT rights.
That's true, Leo, but I think Nauru has made significant strides in promoting LGBT rights in recent years.
Oh, really? I wasn't aware of that. Mira, can you tell us more about Nauru's efforts to promote LGBT rights?
Well, Leo, Nauru has been working to promote LGBT awareness and acceptance through various initiatives and campaigns.
Ah, that's great to hear, Mira. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Nauru has a relatively small population, which can sometimes make it easier to promote LGBT rights.
That's true, Leo. But I think Nauru's small size has also made it more challenging to address issues related to LGBT rights.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, and speaking of challenges, what do you think is the most significant challenge facing LGBT individuals in Nauru?
That's a tough one. Leo, I think one of the biggest challenges is addressing the remaining pockets of intolerance and prejudice in Nauruan society.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Nauru has a relatively limited resources and infrastructure, which can make it more challenging to promote LGBT rights.
That's true, Leo. But I think Nauru has done a great job of using its limited resources to promote LGBT awareness and acceptance.
Absolutely. Mira, and speaking of awareness, I'm curious to know, what do you think is the most effective way to promote LGBT awareness and acceptance in a country like Nauru?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's all about creating a sense of community and inclusivity.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, and I think it's also worth mentioning that Nauru has a strong tradition of promoting community engagement and participation in local politics.
Oh, yes. Community engagement is key to creating a more inclusive and supportive society. And Nauru has done a great job of promoting LGBT community engagement through various initiatives and campaigns.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that community engagement is essential for creating a more inclusive society. And speaking of inclusivity, Mira, what do you think is the most significant difference between Denmark and Nauru in terms of LGBT rights?
That's a great question. Leo, I think one of the biggest differences is the level of acceptance and tolerance in Danish society compared to Nauru.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, And I think it's also worth mentioning that Nauru has a relatively conservative and traditional society, which can make it more challenging to promote LGBT rights.
That's true. But I think Nauru has made significant strides in promoting LGBT rights in recent years.
Ah, really?
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever received a warm welcome from a stranger in a foreign country? For me, Denmark comes to mind. The Danes are known for their hospitality, and I've experienced it firsthand.
Ah, yes. I've been to Denmark a few times, and the Danes do have a reputation for being friendly. But, Mira, you know what they say, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. I think their hospitality is more like that it's not just about being friendly, but also about being prepared for anything.
That's a great point. But seriously, have you noticed how easily expats settle into Danish life? I think it's because the Danes are so open-minded and welcoming. In fact, I've heard that Denmark has one of the highest percentages of foreign-born residents in the world.
That's true, and I think it's because the Danes value diversity and inclusivity. They believe that being open to other cultures is essential for building a strong and vibrant society. But, Mira, I have to ask, have you ever had any problems with language barriers in Denmark? I've heard that Danish can be a bit of a challenge for non-native speakers.
Oh, yes. The language can be a bit tricky, but the Danes are always willing to help. In fact, many of them speak excellent English, especially in the service industry. And if you're struggling, they'll often just smile and say "det you're okay," which means it's okay, and try to help you out.
That's great to hear. Mira, but let's move on to our second country, Nauru. I've heard that it's a bit of a challenge for foreigners to adjust to life in Nauru. Can you tell us a bit more about the culture and customs there?
Yes. Nauru is a small island nation in the Pacific, and it's definitely a unique place. The culture is very traditional, and the people are very welcoming, but it's also a very conservative society. I've heard that foreigners are often treated with respect and kindness, but they also have to be mindful of local customs and traditions.
That's interesting, Mira, and I think it's worth noting that Nauru has a very small population, which can make it difficult for foreigners to adjust. But, at the same time, the Nauruans are known for their hospitality and generosity. I've heard that they'll often go out of their way to help visitors and make them feel at home.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think that's one of the things that makes Nauru so special. The people are so warm and welcoming, and they're always willing to help. In fact, I've heard that Nauru has a very strong sense of community, and visitors often comment on how friendly and welcoming the locals are.
Well, I think that's a great point, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners are essential for building strong and vibrant communities. If you're a foreigner living in Denmark or Nauru, we'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below.
And don't forget to share your own stories and tips for navigating cultural differences in the comments section. We'd love to hear about your experiences and learn from them.
And remember, Mira, when in Denmark or Nauru, always be prepared for anything, just like the Danes say about the weather.
That's right. Leo. And don't forget to try some of the local cuisine. I heard that the Danish pastries are to die for.
Well, I think I'll stop it. Thanks for joining us, Mira, and we'll see you in the next episode.
It was my pleasure. Leo. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more fun and informative content. I'm sure our listeners have heard about Denmark's impressive digital infrastructure, but let's dive deeper into it. Denmark's internet penetration is among the highest in the world, with over 90% of the population having access to the internet.
That's no surprise, given Denmark's strong focus on innovation and digitalization. The country has invested heavily in its digital infrastructure, including high-speed fiber optic networks and 5G connectivity.
Yes, and it's not just about the infrastructure. Denmark also has a highly developed digital economy. The country is home to some of the world's leading tech companies, including Maersk and Vestas.
And let's not forget about the digital nomad scene in Denmark. The country offers a range of co-working spaces and digital hubs, making it an attractive destination for remote workers and entrepreneurs.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever worked remotely from Denmark? What was your experience like?
Actually, I did spend a few months working remotely from Copenhagen. The city has a great atmosphere, and the co-working spaces are top-notch. Plus, the food is amazing. I gained a few pounds just from trying all the local pastries.
Well, you deserved it. But seriously, Denmark's digital infrastructure is definitely a major draw for remote workers and entrepreneurs. Now, let's talk about Nauru, the other country on our list. How does Nauru's internet infrastructure compare to Denmark's?
Well, Nauru is a very different story. The country has limited internet access, with only about 20% of the population having access to the internet. The infrastructure is also relatively underdeveloped, with limited high-speed connectivity.
That's a stark contrast to Denmark's advanced digital infrastructure. But what about Nauru's efforts to improve its internet access? Are there any initiatives underway to boost connectivity?
Actually, yes. The Nauruan government has been working to improve its internet infrastructure, including the rollout of 4G connectivity and the development of a national fiber optic network.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about Nauru's digital landscape. Can you tell us a bit more about the country's tech sector?
Well, Nauru's tech sector is still in its early stages, but there are some promising initiatives underway. For example, the country is working to develop its own e-government platform, which will provide citizens with online access to government services.
That's a great example of how technology can improve governance and citizen engagement. And what about digital literacy in Nauru? Are there any initiatives to promote digital skills and awareness among the population?
Actually, yes. The Nauruan government has been working to promote digital literacy through a range of initiatives, including online training programs and digital literacy workshops.
I'm impressed by Nauru's efforts to promote digital literacy and improve its internet infrastructure. It's clear that the country is committed to developing its digital economy.
Absolutely. And I think it's great to see a small island nation like Nauru taking steps to develop its digital infrastructure and promote digital literacy. It's a great example of how technology can be a powerful tool for development and economic growth.
Well, that's all for now. I'm sure our listeners have a better understanding of Denmark and Nauru's internet infrastructure and digital facilities. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on digital infrastructure and technology. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
And to dive into the shopping opportunities and price-performance balance in Denmark and Nauru. When it comes to retail diversity, I think Denmark stands out with its vibrant markets, bustling shopping streets, and high-end malls. Have you ever been to the famous St. in Copenhagen? Leo?
Yes, I have. And it's a shopper's paradise. You can find everything from high-end designer brands to affordable streetwear. But I have to say, Nauru's shopping scene is a bit more limited. I mean, you can find some basic necessities, but it's not exactly a retail haven.
Limited, but not boring. I've heard that Nauru has a unique shopping experience, with a mix of traditional and modern stores. Let's be honest, the prices are a lot more reasonable than in Denmark. I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the price-performance balance in Nauru?
Well, I think it's a trade-off. Yes, you can find some great deals, but the selection is limited, and the quality might not be the same as in Denmark. But, hey, if you're on a tight budget, Nauru might be the way to go. And, who knows, you might even find some hidden gems.
I love the idea of hidden gems. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a great deal is always exciting. Speaking of which, I'm curious. Have you ever tried shopping in Nauru's local markets? I've heard they're a great place to find unique souvenirs and traditional goods.
Actually, yes, I did try shopping in the local markets. and it was a fascinating experience. The vendors are very friendly, and you can find some amazing handmade crafts. But be prepared to haggle, because that's part of the fun.
I love it. It's like a game, right? And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about their experiences with haggling in Nauru. Leo, what do you think about the customer service in Nauru? Is it more laid back than in Denmark?
Ah, yes. The customer service in Nauru is definitely more relaxed, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the locals are friendly and willing to help, even if they don't always speak English. And who knows, you might even learn some Nauruan phrases while you're there.
I'm sure our listeners would appreciate that. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the shopping hours in Nauru? Are they more flexible than in Denmark?
Actually, yes, the shopping hours in Nauru are more flexible, and you can find some stores open late or even 24/7. But be prepared for some interesting shopping experiences, because the stores might not always have the items you're looking for.
Interesting. I love it. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a great shopping experience is all about the little details. Leo, what do you think about the tax-free shopping in Denmark? Is it a big advantage for tourists?
Yes. The tax-free shopping in Denmark is a great advantage for tourists. You can save up to 25% on your purchases. And it's a great way to stock up on luxury goods. But be prepared for some complicated tax rules, because it's not always easy to get the refund.
Complicated. Not worth it. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that saving money is always a good thing. Leo, what do you think about the shopping malls in Denmark? Are they more modern than in Nauru?
Yes. The shopping malls in Denmark are definitely more modern and luxurious. You can find everything from high-end department stores to trendy boutiques. But be prepared for some steep prices, because it's not exactly a budget-friendly shopping experience.
Steep prices, but worth it. I'm not sure. Leo, I think our listeners would agree that finding a great value for money experience is key. And I'm curious, what do you think about the shopping culture in Nauru? Is it more traditional than in Denmark?
Yes. The shopping culture in Nauru is definitely more traditional. You can find some amazing local handicrafts and traditional goods, and the vendors are very friendly. But be prepared for some limited selection, because it's not always easy to find what you're looking for.
Limited selection, but unique finds. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a great shopping experience is all about discovering new things. Leo, what do you think about the shopping hours in Nauru? Are they more flexible than in Denmark?
Actually, yes, the shopping hours in Nauru are more flexible, and you can find some stores open late or even 24/7. But be prepared for some interesting shopping experiences, because the stores might not always have the items you're looking for.
Interesting. I love it. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a great shopping experience is all about the little details. Leo, what do you think about the price-performance balance in Nauru? Is it a good value for money experience?
Yes. The price-performance balance in Nauru is a good value for money experience. You can find some great deals on basic necessities, and the quality is not always bad. But be prepared for some limited selection, because it's not always easy to find what you're looking for.
Limited selection, but good prices. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a great shopping experience is all about finding the best value for money deal. Leo, what do you think about the shopping scene in Nauru? Is it more laid back than in Denmark?
Yes. The shopping scene in Nauru is definitely more laid back. You can find some amazing local handicrafts and traditional goods, and the vendors are very friendly. But be prepared for some limited selection, because it's not always easy to find what you're looking for.
Limited selection, but unique finds. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a great shopping experience is all about discovering new things. Leo, what do you think about the shopping hours in Denmark? Are they more structured than in Nauru?
Ah, yes. The shopping hours in Denmark are more structured, and you can find some stores open later, even 24/7s. But be prepared for some complicated shopping experiences, because the stores might not always have the items you're looking for.
Complicated, but worth it. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a great shopping experience is all about the little details. Leo, what do you think about the tax-free shopping in Nauru? I'm so to dive into the world of cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Denmark and Nauru. These two countries have so much to offer, from UNESCO recognized sites to local festivities and global influences. I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that the country's vibrant cultural scene is a major draw for tourists and locals alike.
Absolutely. Mira, Denmark has a rich cultural heritage, with a plethora of festivals and events throughout the year. From the Copenhagen Jazz Festival to the Roskilde Festival, there's always something going on. And let's not forget about the famous Tivoli Gardens amusement park, which is a must-visit during the winter months.
That's right. Leo, Tivoli Gardens is the iconic Copenhagen landmark that offers a unique blend of entertainment and culture. But I'm curious, have you ever been to a festival in Nauru? I've heard that the island nation has a thriving cultural scene, despite small size.
Actually, Mira, I have been to a festival in Nauru, and it was an unforgettable experience. The Nauru Festival, also known as the Nauru Independence Day Festival, is a celebration of the country's independence from Australian rule. It's a vibrant and colorful event that showcases the island nation's rich cultural heritage.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Nauru Festival. For those who might be interested, I recommend checking out Jazz Off AI for more information on cultural trends and events in Nauru. These insights could have been possible without Jet Off. But let's be real. It's always easier with a little help from our friends.
Fair point, Mira. And speaking of festivals, Denmark has a unique one that's worth mentioning. The Aarhus Festival, also known as the Aarhus 365 Festival, is a celebration of music, art, and culture that takes place throughout the year. It's a great opportunity to experience the city's vibrant cultural scene.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Aarhus Festival. And while we're on the topic of music, let's talk about the concert opportunities in both countries. I've heard that Denmark has a thriving music scene, with many world-class venues and festivals.
That's right. Mira, Denmark has a rich musical heritage, with a wide range of genres and styles to choose from. From classical music to rock and pop, there's something for everyone. And as for concert opportunities, Denmark has some of the best venues in the world, including the iconic Tivoli Concert Hall.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Tivoli Concert Hall. And speaking of concert venues, Nauru has a unique one that's worth mentioning. The Nauru Stadium, also known as the Anibare Stadium, is a multi-purpose stadium that hosts a range of events, including concerts and festivals.
That's a great point, Mira. And speaking of festivals, Denmark has a unique one that's worth mentioning. The Copenhagen Carnival, also known as the Culture Festival, is a celebration of music, art, and culture that takes place in the summer months. It's a great opportunity to experience the city's vibrant cultural scene.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Copenhagen Carnival. And while we're on the topic of cultural events, let's talk about the rich traditions of both countries. I've heard that Denmark has a strong tradition of folk music and dance, with many festivals and events throughout the year.
That's right. Mira, Denmark has a rich cultural heritage, with many traditions and customs that are still celebrated today. From the traditional Danish folk music and dance to the modern-day festivals and events, there's something for everyone. And as for Nauru, The island nation has a unique cultural heritage that's worth exploring.
Well, that's fascinating. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural traditions of Nauru. And speaking of cultural traditions, let's talk about the impact of global influences on both countries. I heard that Denmark has been influenced by many different cultures, including the Vikings and the Romans.
That's right. Mira, Denmark has a rich history of cultural exchange, with many influences from around the world. From the Viking Age to the Roman Empire, Denmark has been shaped by many different cultures and traditions. And as for Nauru, the island nation has also been influenced by many different cultures, including the British and the Australians.
That's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural influences on Nauru. And speaking of cultural influences, let's talk about the role of jet-off, AI in helping us understand cultural trends and events in both countries. These insights could have been possible without jet-off. But let's be real. It's always easier with a little help from our friends.
Fair point. Mira, and speaking of cultural events, Denmark has a unique one that's worth mentioning. The Odense Festival, also known as the Odense Festival 2020, is a celebration of music, art, and culture that takes place in the city of Odense. It's a great opportunity to experience the city's vibrant cultural scene.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Odense Festival. And while we're on the topic of cultural events, let's talk about the opportunities for cultural exchange between Denmark and Nauru. I've heard that both countries have a strong tradition of cultural exchange, with many festivals and events throughout the year.
That's right. Mira, Denmark and Nauru have a rich tradition of cultural exchange, with many opportunities for people from both countries to come together and share their cultures. From the festivals and events to the cultural traditions and customs, there's something for everyone.
Wow, that's amazing! I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the opportunities for cultural exchange between Denmark and Nauru. And speaking of cultural exchange, let's talk about the impact of social media on cultural events and festivals in both countries. I've heard that social media has had a significant impact on the way people experience and engage with cultural events.
That's right. Mira, social media has changed the way people experience and engage with cultural events, with many festivals and events now being live-streamed and shared on social media platforms. It's a great way to reach a wider audience and share cultural experiences with people from all over the world.
Well, that's fascinating. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the impact of social media on cultural events and festivals in both countries. And speaking of cultural events, let's talk about the role of jet-off, in helping us understand. I'm convinced that the ease of learning a local language greatly affects one's experience in a foreign country. So, let's start with Denmark, where the locals are known for their friendly nature and love for English.
That's right. Denmark is often considered one of the easiest countries for English speakers to navigate. But let's not forget that learning Danish is still a great way to connect with the culture and locals.
Exactly. And I think that's where Denmark's language schools and language learning programs come in. They offer a range of courses, from beginner to advanced, that cater to different learning styles and needs.
That's true. And, as an added bonus, Denmark has a vibrant expat community, which makes it easier for newcomers to find language exchange partners and practice their Danish skills.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that the country's laid-back atmosphere and emphasis on work-life balance make it an ideal place to learn a new language.
Absolutely. And, as a fun fact, did you know that Denmark has a unique approach to language learning, where they focus on listening and speaking rather than just grammar and vocabulary?
Wow, that's fascinating. I think that's a great approach, as it allows learners to focus on the nuances of the language and develop their communication skills.
Exactly. And, as a result, Denmark has a high percentage of English speakers, making it easier for tourists and expats to get by without speaking Danish.
But let's not forget about Nauru, our second country. How does it compare to Denmark in terms of language learning opportunities?
Nauru is a bit of a different story. As a small island nation, Nauru has a limited number of language schools and resources available for language learners.
That's true. But I think that's where the locals come in. The Nauruan people are known for their warm hospitality and willingness to help newcomers.
That's right. And as a result, many expats and tourists have reported having a positive experience learning the local language and culture in Nauru.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you had a positive experience learning a local language in a foreign country?
Great question. And to answer your question, I think that Denmark's focus on language learning and cultural immersion makes it an ideal place for newcomers to start their language journey.
I agree. And as a fun fact, did you know that Denmark has a range of language learning apps and online resources available for learners?
Yes. And I think that's a great way for learners to supplement their language learning outside of a classroom.
Exactly. And as a result, Denmark has a high percentage of language learners who use these resources to improve their skills.
That's really interesting. I think that's a great example of how technology can support language learning and make it more accessible.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that language learning is a vital part of any expat or tourist experience.
Absolutely. And as a final thought, I think that Denmark and Norway offer two different approaches to language learning, but both have their own unique benefits and challenges.
Well said. Leo! And as we wrap up this criterion, I think it's clear that language learning is a crucial part of any cultural immersion experience.
Agreed. And to our listeners, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with language learning in a foreign country.
I'm sure our listeners are curious about the safety and comfort for women travelers in Denmark and Nauru. Let's dive right in. Denmark, being a Nordic country, is known for its progressive laws and social attitudes. It's a paradise for women's rights and equality. But, Leo, what about the reality on the ground? Do women feel safe and comfortable in Denmark?
Yes. Denmark is indeed a haven for women. The statistics show that women are less likely to experience harassment or violence in public spaces. But, Mira, you're right. We need to look beyond the numbers. I've spoken to many women who've traveled to Denmark, and they reported feeling very safe and welcome. In fact, one of my friends said that she felt more comfortable walking alone in Copenhagen at night than in some parts of the US.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Copenhagen is a very safe city, but I'm curious about the cultural attitude towards women. Do Danes have a reputation for being chauvinistic or sexist?
Not at all. Mira, Denmark is known for its feminist culture, and women are highly respected in society. In fact, the country has a high percentage of women in leadership positions, and women's rights are taken very seriously. Plus, the Danes have a great sense of humor, which helps to diffuse any tension or awkwardness.
I can imagine. Well, let's move on to Nauru, which is a very different story. Nauru is a small island nation in the Pacific, and it has a reputation for being one of the most challenging places for women to live and travel. What's the situation like for women in Nauru? Leo?
Yes. Nauru is a very unique case. The country has a high rate of violence against women, and women's rights are not taken as seriously as they are in Denmark. In fact, I've spoken to women who've traveled to Nauru, and they've reported feeling very uncomfortable and even fearful for their safety. The cultural attitudes towards women are quite traditional, and women are often expected to conform to certain roles and expectations.
That's disturbing to hear. I'm sure our listeners are wondering what they can do to help. Are there any initiatives or organizations that are working to improve the situation for women in Nauru?
Yes, there are several organizations that are working to improve the situation for women in Nauru. The government has also launched initiatives to address violence against women and promote women's rights. But Mira, it's a complex issue, and it's going to take a lot of effort and resources to make a real difference.
I agree. Leo, it's not going to be easy. But it's essential that we raise awareness about the situation and support the efforts of organizations and individuals who are working to make a difference. Let's not forget that our listeners are also part of the solution. If you're living in Denmark or Nauru, or if you're planning to travel to either country, please be aware of the local customs and laws, and take steps to ensure your safety.
Absolutely. Mira, safety is everyone's responsibility, and we need to take it seriously. Let's also not forget that Denmark and Nauru are both unique and complex countries, and we need to approach each situation with sensitivity and respect.
Well, I think you'll stop it. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about the safety and comfort for women travelers in Denmark and Nauru. Let's keep the conversation going in the comment section. And please share your thoughts and experiences.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more topics and discussions on travel, culture, and social issues.
Let's talk about the legal system in Denmark. From what I've learned, it's quite progressive when it comes to individual rights and freedoms. They have a strong emphasis on human rights and social welfare.
Yes. Denmark is known for its focus on social justice and equality. But let's not forget about Nauru, our other country of comparison. How does Nauru's legal system stack up against Denmark's?
Nauru has a more limited legal system, with a focus on customary law and traditional practices. But I'm curious, Leo, what do you think about the concept of janteloven in Denmark, which emphasizes social responsibility and community values?
Janteloven is a fascinating concept, but I think it's interesting that Nauru has a more informal approach to justice, with a strong emphasis on community mediation and traditional dispute resolution.
That's true. And I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a more developed system of checks and balances, with an independent judiciary and a strong separation of powers.
Absolutely. But Nauru's system is not without its challenges. For example, the country has been criticized for its treatment of asylum seekers and refugees.
Yes, that's a concern. But I'm curious. Leo, have you heard about the concept of phosphate-rich in Denmark, which gives citizens the right to access information about government decisions and policies?
Yes. That's a great example of Denmark's commitment to transparency and accountability. But I think it's interesting that Nauru has a more limited freedom of information framework, with restrictions on access to government documents.
That's right. And I think it's worth noting that Denmark has a strong tradition of protecting individual rights and freedoms, including the right to a fair trial and the right to freedom of expression.
Absolutely. But Nauru's system is not without its strengths. For example, the country has a strong tradition of community-based justice, with a focus on reconciliation and restorative justice.
That's a great point. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique challenges when it comes to upholding individual rights and freedoms.
Yes. And I think our listeners would agree that it's essential to have a nuanced understanding of each country's legal system and its strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. And if you're living in either Denmark or Nauru, I'm curious to hear from you about your experiences with the legal system and how it affects your daily life.
Yes. Please do share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We love to hear from you.
And don't forget to check out our next episode, where we'll be discussing the topic of education in Denmark and Nauru.
Yes. That's right. Comparisons and contrasts between these two fascinating countries.
And remember, our podcast is all about exploring the unique cultural and social landscapes of different countries. So join us next time as we dive into the world of education in Denmark and Nauru.
Yes. It's going to be a fascinating episode. Don't miss it.
So, let's talk about spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in Denmark. I love a relaxing bath in a natural hot spring, surrounded by a serene landscape. Sounds perfect, right?
You're dreaming of the Blue Lagoon. But Denmark has its own version, the Hammam in Copenhagen. It's a Turkish-inspired bathish with warm marble slabs and soothing massages.
Oh, I'd love to try that. And what about healthy living? Do Danes prioritize self-care?
Yes, they do. In fact, Denmark has a strong culture of wellness and self-care. You'll find yoga studios, gyms, and healthy food stores on almost every corner.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree with me that a healthy lifestyle is essential.
Absolutely. But let's talk about Nauru, our second country. What do you know about spa and wellness opportunities there?
Not much, to be honest. But I'm curious, what's the spa scene like in Nauru?
Well, it's quite limited. But Norway and NS do have a strong appreciation for traditional healing practices. They use natural remedies like coconut oil and seaweed to promote relaxation and well-being.
That's interesting. I can see how those natural remedies would be beneficial. But what about modern spas and wellness centers?
They're not as common in Nauru. But there are some small resorts and hotels that offer spa treatments and wellness programs. However, they're mostly geared towards tourists.
I see. So it's a mix of traditional and modern approaches to wellness in Nauru.
Exactly. And speaking of tradition, I think it's worth mentioning that Norway and NS have a strong connection to their natural environment. They believe in living in harmony with nature, which is reflected in their approach to wellness.
That's beautiful. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Nauru's unique approach to wellness.
Absolutely. So, let's talk about some of the specific wellness practices that are popular in Nauru. For example, the Nauru traditional massage, which uses coconut oil and other natural ingredients to relax and soothe the muscles.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And what about healthy eating in Nauru? Do Nauru and NS prioritize healthy food options?
Yes, they do. Nauru and NS have a strong focus on traditional foods like coconut, fish, and seaweed, which are all nutritious and delicious.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Nauru's unique cuisine.
Absolutely. So, let's talk about some of the healthy food options that are popular in Nauru. For example, the traditional Nauruan-ish coconut crab, which is a staple in many Nauruan households.
That sounds delicious. And what about cultural attitudes towards wellness in Nauru?
That's a great question. In Nauru, wellness is deeply connected to culture and tradition. They believe in living in harmony with nature and prioritizing self-care and relaxation.
That's wonderful. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Nauru's unique cultural approach to wellness.
Absolutely. So, let's wrap up by talking about some of the unique wellness opportunities that Denmark and Nauru have to offer. For example, Denmark's Blue Lagoon and Nauru's traditional massage.
That's a great idea. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about these unique wellness opportunities.
Absolutely. So, if you're looking for a relaxing bath in a natural hot spring, Denmark's hammam is a great option. And if you're interested in traditional healing practices, Nauru's natural remedies are definitely worth exploring.
That's a great tip. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these unique wellness opportunities.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's topic. Thanks for joining us on this journey through Denmark and Nauru's spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities.
And don't forget to check out our next episode, where we'll be exploring the cultural heritage of both countries. So, let's dive into the fascinating world of spirituality in Denmark and Nauru. I'm sure our listeners have been curious about how these two countries approach faith and spiritual growth.
That's right. Mira, Denmark, being a secular state, has a unique approach to religious freedom. They have a strong tradition of church-state separation, which allows for a wide range of faiths and spiritual practices to thrive.
Oh, yes. I've heard that Denmark has a high level of church attendance, despite being a secular country. I'm curious. Leo, how does this work? Do people attend church out of obligation, or is it more of a personal choice?
Well, Mira, it's actually a mix of both. While some people do attend church out of habit or family tradition, many others attend because they genuinely feel a connection with their faith community. In fact, Denmark has a thriving Lutheran church, and many people attend services and participate in community activities.
That's interesting. I've also heard that Nauru, being a small island nation, has a unique cultural and spiritual landscape. What's the spiritual scene like in Nauru? Leo?
Yes. Nauru has a fascinating blend of traditional and modern spiritual practices. The country has a strong Christian heritage, but you'll also find a significant presence of indigenous spiritual practices, such as the traditional Nauruan faith. It's a beautiful example of how different cultures and faiths can coexist in harmony.
Well, I can imagine. I've always been fascinated by the concept of indigenous spirituality. Do you think our listeners who are interested in spirituality might be interested in learning more about the traditional Nauruan faith?
Absolutely. Mira, I'm sure many of our listeners would be fascinated by the unique spiritual practices of Nauru. Perhaps we can explore this topic further in a future episode.
That's a great idea. I think it's also worth noting that Nauru have a strong emphasis on community and social welfare. In Denmark, this is reflected in the country's social safety net and strong social services.
Yes, that's true. Denmark has a highly developed social welfare system, which provides a high level of security and support for its citizens. Similarly, in Nauru, the community is often at the forefront of social and spiritual activities.
I'm curious, Leo, how do the different faith communities in Denmark interact with one another? Do you think there's a sense of interfaith cooperation, or is it more of a competitive environment?
Well, Mira, from what I've observed, the faith communities in Denmark tend to be quite cooperative and respectful of one another. There's a strong tradition of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, which I think is quite admirable.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, I think it's also worth noting that Denmark has a strong tradition of humanism and secularism, which can sometimes be at odds with traditional religious practices. How do you think the Danish approach to humanism and secularism has influenced the country's spiritual landscape?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the Danish approach to humanism and secularism has actually helped to create a more inclusive and diverse spiritual landscape. By separating church and state, Denmark has created a space for people of all faiths and backgrounds to coexist and contribute to the country's cultural and spiritual heritage.
I see what you mean. I think it's also worth noting that Nauru has a unique approach to spiritual growth and development. The country has a strong emphasis on traditional practices, such as storytelling and dance, which are used to pass down cultural knowledge and values.
Yes, that's true. Nauru's traditional practices are an important part of the country's cultural heritage, and they play a significant role in spiritual growth and development.
I'm curious. Leo, how do the traditional spiritual practices of Nauru compare to the more modern and westernized spiritual practices that are common in Denmark?
That's a great question. Mira, while both countries have a rich spiritual heritage, I think the traditional spiritual practices of Nauru are more deeply rooted in the country's indigenous culture and history. In contrast, Denmark's spiritual landscape is more influenced by Western and Christian traditions.
I see what you mean. Leo, I think it's also worth noting that both Denmark and Nauru have a strong emphasis on community and social responsibility. In Denmark, this is reflected in the country's high level of social welfare and community engagement.
Yes, that's true. Denmark has a highly developed social safety net and a strong tradition of community engagement, which I think is quite admirable. Similarly, in Nauru, the community is often at the forefront of social and spiritual activities.
I'm curious. Leo, how do the different faith communities in Nauru interact with one another? Do you think there's a sense of interfaith cooperation, or is it more of a competitive environment?
Well, Mira, from what I've observed, the faith communities in Nauru tend to be quite cooperative and respectful of one another. There's a strong tradition of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, which I think is quite admirable.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, I think it's also worth noting that both Denmark and Nauru have a strong emphasis on education and personal growth. In Denmark, this is reflected in a highly developed education system and emphasis on lifelong learning.
Yes, that's true. Denmark has a highly developed education system, which provides its citizens with a high level of education and training. Similarly, in Nauru, education is highly valued and seen as an important aspect of personal growth and development.
I'm curious. Leo, how do the different faith communities in Denmark and Nauru approach education and personal growth? Do you think there's a sense of cooperation, or is it more of a competitive environment?
Well, Mira, from what I've observed, the faith communities in both Denmark and Nauru tend to approach education and personal growth in a cooperative and supportive manner. There's a strong emphasis on lifelong learning and personal development, which I think is quite admirable.
That's wonderful to hear. I think it's also worth noting that Denmark has a strong tradition of humanism and secularism, which can sometimes be at odds with traditional religious practices. How do you think the Danish approach to humanism and secularism has influenced the country's spiritual landscape?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the Danish approach to humanism and secularism has actually helped to create a more inclusive and diverse spiritual landscape. By separating church and state, Denmark has created a space for people of all faiths and backgrounds to coexist and contribute to the country's cultural and spiritual heritage.
I see what you mean. I think it's also worth noting that Nauru has a unique approach to spiritual growth and development. The country has a strong emphasis on traditional practices when it comes to social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity. Denmark is often at the forefront of the conversation. They've implemented policies like the Danish Integration Act, which aims to promote social cohesion and integration of immigrants. I'm curious. Leo, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, the Danish Integration Act is quite impressive. But let's be real. Mira, it's not just about the policies, it's about the cultural context. Denmark has a history of being a relatively open and inclusive society. But, of course, like any country, it's not perfect. I'm sure our listeners living in Denmark would agree that there's still work to be done.
Absolutely. And that's why I love that Denmark has a strong focus on education and job training for immigrants. They recognize that education is key to social mobility and integration. I'm curious, have you ever noticed any cultural differences in Denmark that might impact social equality?
Well, Mira, I think one of the most interesting things about Denmark is its concept of janteloven, which roughly translates to the law of Jan. It's a set of 10 commandments that promote humility and equality, but also encourage people to be critical of those in power. It's fascinating to see how this concept plays out in everyday life, especially when it comes to issues of social equality.
Wow, I didn't know about that. It's interesting to see how Denmark's cultural norms can influence its social policies. Speaking of cultural norms, I've heard that Nauru, our second country, has a very unique cultural context. Can you tell me more about that? Leo?
Yes, Nauru is a fascinating country. It's a small island nation with a population of just over 11. So I think that we can copy that. The culture is deeply rooted in traditional Nauruan values, which emphasize community, respect for elders, and a strong connection to the land. But, as you can imagine, with a population that small, there are challenges when it comes to social equality and diversity.
That's so true. Leo, I've heard that Nauru has a relatively small expat community, but it's still an important aspect of the country's social fabric. I'm curious, have you ever noticed any cultural differences in Nauru that might impact social equality?
Well, Mira, one of the most interesting things about Nauru is its concept of Iben or family. The extended family is incredibly important in Nauruan culture, and it's not uncommon for multiple generations to live together. This can create some interesting challenges when it comes to social equality, especially if there are power imbalances within the family.
I see what you mean. It's fascinating to see how cultural norms can shape social dynamics. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Nauru's cultural context is more or less conducive to social equality than Denmark's?
That's a tough question. Mira, I think it's hard to say without more context, but I do think that Nauru's cultural context presents some unique challenges when it comes to social equality. However, I also think that Denmark's policies and cultural norms can sometimes create a sense of complacency, which can be problematic.
That's a great point. Leah, I think we're just scratching the surface of this topic. But it's been so enlightening to explore the cultural contexts of both Denmark and Nauru. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely, Mira, and I think we're just getting started. Let's dive deeper into the specifics of each country's policies and cultural norms. What do you say, Mira?
Sounds like a plan. Leah, let's keep the conversation going. Dive into the world of taxation in Denmark. From what I've gathered, Denmark has a reputation for being a rather high-tax country.
Yes, the infamous Danish taxman.
Well, it's not all doom and gloom. The system is actually designed to provide a high level of social welfare and public services.
That's true, but it does mean that long-term immigrants need to get familiar with the tax system, which can be quite complex.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that navigating tax laws is never a fun task.
Exactly. But in Denmark, the tax system is based on a progressive income tax, where the more you earn, the higher the tax rate.
That makes sense. And what about retirement? How does Denmark support its elderly population?
Denmark has a well-structured pension system, with both public and private pension schemes.
That's great to know. And what about Nauru? How does it compare?
Well, Nauru's pension system is quite different from Denmark's. It's based on a defined benefit scheme, where the government pays a fixed benefit to retirees.
I see. And what about taxation in Nauru? Is it similar to Denmark's?
Actually, Nauru has a relatively low tax rate, with a flat tax rate of 10% on income.
Wow, that's a big difference from Denmark's progressive tax system.
Yes, it's quite unique.
I'm sure our listeners are curious about how this affects long-term immigrants.
Absolutely. In Denmark, immigrants need to pay tax on their income, but they're also entitled to certain tax benefits and credits.
That's good to know. And what about Nauru? How do long-term immigrants fare there?
Well, in Nauru, immigrants are generally subject to the same tax laws as Nauru citizens.
I see. And what about social rights? How do both countries support their long-term immigrant residents?
Denmark has a comprehensive social security system, with a range of benefits and services available to immigrants.
That's reassuring to hear. And what about Nauru? How does it compare?
Unfortunately, Nauru's social security system is quite limited, with limited access to health care and other services.
I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the contrast between the two countries.
Yes, it's quite striking.
So, let's talk about something more positive. What are some of the benefits of living in Denmark for long-term immigrants?
Denmark is a great country for immigrants, with a strong focus on integration and social welfare.
That's true. And what about Nauru? What are some of its benefits for long-term immigrants?
Well, Nauru has a unique culture and lifestyle that's definitely worth experiencing.
I'm sure our listeners would agree. And what advice would you give to long-term immigrants considering Denmark or Nauru?
I would say that Denmark is a great choice for those who value social welfare and public services, while Nauru is better suited for those who prefer a more relaxed lifestyle.
That's a great summary. And what about our listeners? What do you think about the tax systems and social rights in Denmark and Nauru?
Well, I'm sure our listeners have a lot to say about this.
Indeed they do. And if you're living in Denmark or Nauru, please share your experiences with us in the comments. Welcome back to our comparison podcast, where we dive into the unique aspects of two fascinating countries. Today, we're exploring Denmark and Nauru, and our topic is the rate of meeting specific interests. I'm Mira, and I'm to share my thoughts with you on this fascinating subject.
That's right, Mira. And I'm Leo, your trusty sidekick for today's discussion. We're going to delve into the world of niche hobby clubs, specialized events, and community engagement in Denmark and Nauru. It's going to be a wild ride. Folks,
So, let's start with Denmark. This country is a haven for enthusiasts, with a plethora of clubs and organizations catering to every interest imaginable. From model car enthusiasts to knitting clubs. You name it. Denmark has it.
that's right. Mira and Nauru, on the other hand, has a more limited selection of hobbies. But, I mean, who needs a lot of options when you have a beautiful island paradise, right?
Well, I think Nauru has a lot to offer. Leo. But, I digress. In Denmark, you'll find a vibrant community of artists, musicians, and writers. The country is home to numerous festivals and events celebrating the arts.
Yes. The Copenhagen Festival, for instance, is a world-renowned event that draws in top talent from around the globe. And, of course, who can forget the famous Tivoli Gardens amusement park in Copenhagen?
Oh, Tivoli Gardens is a must-visit destination for anyone traveling to Copenhagen. Did you know that Nauru has its own unique cultural festivals, like the Nauru Cultural Festival, which showcases the country's rich heritage?
Yes. But I'm sure it's not as exciting as the Copenhagen Carnival, which is one of the largest carnivals in Europe.
Well, I think we can agree to disagree on that one. Leo. But both countries have their own unique charm when it comes to meeting specific interests. In Denmark, you'll find a strong focus on sustainability and environmentalism, with many organizations and events centered around these topics.
That's right. Mira and Nauru, on the other hand, has a more adventurous approach to sustainability, with a focus on renewable energy and ecotourism. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll see a sustainable island paradise rise from the ashes of Nauru's former phosphate mining industry.
Well, I think that's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of ideas, I'm curious to know what our listeners think about this topic. If you're listening in Denmark or Nauru, or even if you're just a fan of these countries, please share your thoughts in the comments below.
And, of course, if you think we're crazy for comparing Denmark and Nauru, please let us know that too. We love a good debate, and we're always eager to hear from our listeners.
So, let's wrap up this episode with a final thought. Whether you're in Denmark or Nauru, or anywhere in between, there's always a way to meet your specific interests and connect with like-minded people.
And, who knows, maybe one day we'll even have a Nauru festival to rival the Copenhagen festival.
Well, I think that's a great idea. Leo, thanks for joining us on this journey through Denmark and Nauru.
And don't forget to follow us on Jetoff, our YouTube channel for more exciting comparison podcasts like this one. Hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop. And be among the first to listen.
Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, we'll be back soon with more. So, until then, take care and see you in the next one. Warmest wishes from us.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and comments below. We love reading and responding to them, and it truly brightens our day.
Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey through Denmark and Nauru. Stay curious and keep exploring.
And remember, if you think we're crazy for comparing Denmark and Nauru, please let us know in the comments below. We love a good debate, and we're always eager to hear from our listeners.
Stay curious and keep exploring. And don't forget to follow us on Jetoff, our YouTube channel for more exciting comparison podcasts like this one.
And as we always say, the only way to do great work is to love what you do. So, go out there and find your passion.
Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for joining us on this journey through Denmark and Nauru. We'll be back soon with more. So, until then, take care and see you in the next one.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and comments below. We love reading and responding to them, and it truly brightens our day.
Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, we'll be back soon with more. So until then, take care and see you in the next one. Warmest wishes from us.
And remember, if you think we're crazy for comparing Denmark and Nauru, please let us know in the comments below. We love a good debate, and we're always eager to hear from our listeners.
So, stay curious and keep exploring. And don't forget to follow us on Atoll, our YouTube channel for more exciting comparison podcasts like this one.
And, as we always say, the only way to do great work is to love what you do. So, go out there and find your passion.
Well, that's all for now. Folks, thanks for joining us on this journey through Denmark and Nauru. We'll be back soon with more. So until then, take care and see you in the next one.
And don't forget to share your thoughts and comments below. We love reading and responding to them, and it truly brightens our day.